The doors of the great hall slammed open before Lila could steady her breath, and every face inside turned toward her at once. She had never wanted to be here. The summit hall of the Northfell Pack stretched wider than any building she had ever stood inside, its stone pillars rising like the legs of giants, and the crowd gathered beneath them made her feel smaller than she already was. Her stepbrother Colin gripped her wrist so hard that her fingers went numb, pulling her forward across the polished floor. "Smile," he hissed under his breath. "You are here to be useful, not to embarrass me." Lila said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was safer than argument. Around her, tall alphas and proud betas whispered to one another, their eyes sliding over her plain gray dress and her small frame. Someone laughed. She did not need to hear the words to know they were about her. The hall had been built for wolves who ruled entire territories, not for someone like her. At barely 5 feet tall, with thin shoulders and a soft voice that often got lost in loud rooms, Lila had spent her whole life being the smallest person wherever she went. Smallest in her village, smallest in her family, smallest in every pack gathering her stepbrother forced her to attend. Colin pulled her toward the front of the hall, where the low nobles waited to be acknowledged by the new Alpha King. Word had spread through every territory that King Rowan Ashgrove had taken the throne only weeks ago, after his father's sudden death, and this summit was his first true test as ruler. Packs from across the region had come to see if he could hold power, or if he would crumble the way many young kings did. "Stand up straight," Colin muttered, "and do not speak unless someone speaks to you first." Lila straightened her spine, though it did little to change how she looked next to the powerful figures surrounding her. She kept her gaze low, watching the floor, counting the tiles beneath her worn shoes as a way to steady her racing heart. Then the horn sounded, and the room fell into a hush so complete that Lila could hear her own pulse in her ears. King Rowan entered from a side archway, and the entire hall bent forward in a wave of respect. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair cut short, and eyes the color of deep river water. He wore no crown, only a simple black coat, yet something about the way he moved told everyone in the room that he did not need golden decoration to prove his power. He walked with the calm certainty of someone who had already survived more than most people twice his age. Lila had heard stories about him from the servants who traveled between packs. Some said he was cold. Others said he was fair but untested. She had expected someone hardened, maybe even cruel, the way many alphas became once they held power. But as he crossed the hall, his eyes moved briefly over the crowd, not with arrogance, but with quiet awareness, as if he were memorizing every face that stood before him. Colin straightened immediately, releasing Lila's wrist, just enough to bow low as the king passed near their section. Lila bowed as well, though her legs, tired from the long journey, trembled slightly beneath her. It happened in an instant. Her foot caught the hem of her dress. She stumbled forward, arms flailing, and a gasp rippled through the nearby nobles as she nearly collided with the floor in front of everyone. Laughter broke out almost immediately, sharp and cruel, the kind of laughter that came easily to people who had never known what it felt like to be small in a room full of giants. But before she could hit the ground, a strong hand caught her arm. She looked up, breath caught in her throat, and found herself staring directly into the deep eyes of the Alpha King. The laughter stopped as quickly as it started. Rowan held her steady, his grip firm but gentle, as if he understood exactly how fragile the moment was for her. "Careful," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she and those closest could hear. "The floor is treacherous, not you." Lila's cheeks burned. She wanted to disappear entirely, to fold into herself, and vanish from the hundreds of eyes now watching. But something about his words settled the panic building inside her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, barely able to meet his gaze. He studied her for a moment longer than necessary, as though something about her had caught his attention beyond the simple act of catching her before she fell. Then he turned to the crowd, his expression shifting into something colder, sharper, a warning wrapped in calm authority. "I did not realize this hall found entertainment in another person's misfortune," he said, his voice carrying easily across the silent room. "Perhaps someone would like to explain the joke to me directly." No one spoke. The nobles who had laughed moments earlier now stared at the floor, suddenly finding great interest in their own boots. Rowan released Lila's arm slowly, making sure she had regained her balance before stepping back. "Continue," he said simply, and the summit resumed as though nothing had happened. though the air in the hall felt different now, charged with something unspoken. Colin leaned close to Lila, his voice tight with irritation rather than concern. "What did you say to him?" "Nothing," Lila answered honestly. "He was only being kind." Colin's eyes narrowed, calculating. Lila recognized that look. It was the same look he wore whenever he saw an opportunity to use someone for his own gain. She had seen it directed at merchants, at village elders, and now, apparently, at her. "Kindness from a king is not nothing," Colin murmured. "It is an opening." Lila wanted to tell him that she wanted no part of his schemes, that she had not asked for the king's attention, and did not want to be used as a tool in whatever plan was already forming behind her stepbrother's eyes. But she knew better than to argue with him in public. Arguments were saved for behind closed doors, where no one could witness the truth of how he treated her. The summit continued through the afternoon, filled with formal announcements, treaty discussions, and displays of loyalty from lesser pacts, seeking favor with the new king. Lila stood near the back with the other low-ranking attendees, doing her best to remain unnoticed. She watched Rowan carefully from a distance, curious despite herself. He listened more than he spoke. When nobles postured and exaggerated their own importance, he watched them with quiet patience, occasionally asking a single sharp question that revealed the weakness in their arguments. He did not raise his voice, yet every wolf in that hall seemed to lean toward him when he spoke, hungry for his approval. At one point, a dispute broke out between two smaller packs over a shared water source, each side shouting accusations at the other. Rowan raised a single hand, and the shouting stopped instantly. "You will resolve this through reason," he said, "or I will resolve it for you, and neither side will like my solution." The two representatives exchanged nervous glances before falling into quieter, more measured discussion. Lila found herself impressed, despite her exhaustion. She had expected a king crowned so young, so soon after loss, to struggle beneath the weight of leadership. Instead, he carried it as though it had always belonged to him. As evening approached and the summit began to wind down, servants moved through the hall, offering food and drink to the gathered nobles. Lila remained near the wall, hungry, but unwilling to draw attention to herself by reaching for anything, before those of higher rank had been served. It was a rule she had learned early, one enforced strictly whenever Colin brought her to these gatherings. A servant approached her directly, holding a tray of bread and warm stew. "For you," the young woman said kindly. "The king asked that you be served first from this table." Lila blinked in surprise. "There must be a mistake." "No mistake," the servant said, smiling faintly, before moving along to the next guest. Lila glanced across the hall, and found Rowan speaking with a group of senior alphas, seemingly uninterested in her direction. Yet she could not shake the feeling that his instruction had been deliberate, a quiet gesture, meant to counter the humiliation she had suffered earlier, without drawing further attention to her. Colin noticed the food as well, his eyes narrowing with calculation once more. "Interesting," he said softly. "Very interesting indeed." Lila ate quietly, ignoring her stepbrother's scheming expression, focusing instead on the warmth of the stew, and the strange comfort of feeling, for the first time in a long while, that someone in a position of power had noticed her, without wanting anything in return. As the summit finally ended, and guests began preparing for the journey home, or their assigned quarters within the palace grounds, Colin pulled Lila aside into a quiet corridor, away from prying ears. "You will find a way to speak with him again," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Tomorrow, during the open council hour, you will make yourself useful to him." "I don't want to be useful to anyone," Lila said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I only want to go home." Colin's grip tightened on her shoulder, his patience thinning. "Home is a small village, with no future and no protection. Do you understand what an alliance with the king could mean for our family? For your safety?" Lila lowered her eyes, the familiar weight of obligation settling over her once more. She had spent her entire life being told what she owed to others, what she needed to sacrifice for the sake of family, safety, and survival. She was tired of it, though tired had never been enough to change anything. "Fine," she whispered. "I will attend tomorrow." Colin released her shoulder, satisfaction replacing his irritation. "Good. Do not disappoint me." Alone in the small guest chamber assigned to her that night, Lila sat by the narrow window and looked out over the palace grounds. moonlight spilling across stone courtyards and distant training fields where soldiers still practiced despite the late hour. She thought of the king's steady hand catching her before she fell, of his quiet words cutting through cruel laughter, of the food sent to her without explanation or expectation. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, or what Colin truly intended to gain from whatever plan formed behind his calculating eyes. But for the first time since arriving at the summit, Lila allowed herself a small, cautious feeling of curiosity, rather than dread. Somewhere within these palace walls, a king who ruled with quiet strength had looked at her, the smallest person in the room, and treated her not as an object to be dismissed, but as someone worth a moment of genuine respect. Before sleep finally claimed her, Lila let her mind wander back over every detail of the day, searching for some clue as to why a king, with an entire kingdom to manage, would spare a single thought for a stranger who had stumbled in front of his court. She told herself it meant nothing. Kings were taught to appear fair in public. Perhaps his kindness had been nothing more than good instinct, a habit built from years of training in leadership rather than any true interest in her as a person. Yet the memory of his eyes lingered stubbornly in her thoughts. There had been no pity in them, no condescension, only a quiet attentiveness that she had rarely received from anyone in her life. Even her own father, before his passing, had often overlooked her in favor of Colin, who was louder, taller, and far more skilled at demanding attention. She thought of her mother as well, gone now for nearly 6 years, and the soft words she used to whisper whenever Lila felt smaller than the world around her. Size is not the measure of a person's worth, her mother had told her once, kneeling to meet her eyes after a group of village children had mocked her height. What matters is the size of your courage, and yours, little one, is larger than you know. Lila had clung to those words through years of ridicule, through Colin's cold ambition after their parents died, through countless gatherings where she stood at the edges of rooms built for people far more important than herself. She rarely believed the words fully, not anymore. But tonight, for reasons she could not entirely explain, they felt closer to true than they had in a very long time. Outside her window, torchlight flickered along the palace walls, and somewhere in the distance, she heard the low murmur of soldiers changing their watch. The palace itself felt alive, in a way her village never had, full of movement and purpose, danger and opportunity intertwined so closely that she could not tell where one ended and the other began. She wondered, briefly, what kind of man Rowan truly was, beneath the composed authority he wore like armor. A king who had lost his father suddenly, thrust into power before he was fully prepared, yet who somehow commanded an entire hall of quarreling nobles into silence, with nothing more than a raised hand and a level voice. There was a heaviness behind his eyes that she recognized, the particular exhaustion of someone who carried responsibilities far beyond what their years should demand. Perhaps that was why he had noticed her stumble, she thought. Perhaps someone who understood the weight of being underestimated recognized it easily in others. Or perhaps she was imagining connections that did not exist, searching for meaning in a single moment of basic decency, because her life had given her so little decency to hold on to. Either way, tomorrow would bring the open council hour, and with it, whatever plan Colin intended to set into motion. Lila did not know if she had the strength to refuse him again, not when he held so much power over her daily life, her shelter, her very survival within their small and fractured family. But she promised herself one thing, as her eyes finally grew heavy with sleep. She would not become someone's tool without at least understanding why. If the king wished to speak with her again, she would let him. If Colin's schemes brought her closer to the throne, she would use that closeness to protect herself, rather than simply becoming another piece moved across someone else's board. She had spent too many years being small in the eyes of others. Perhaps it was time she learned to be small only in stature, and nothing else. The last thing she remembered before sleep finally claimed her was the warmth of the stew a stranger had brought at the king's request, and the steady, certain grip of his hand, catching her before she could fall. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, a soft wind moved through the training fields, carrying with it the scent of rain that had not yet arrived. Lila slept more soundly that night than she had in many months, unaware that across the palace, in his own private chambers, King Rowan sat awake far longer than usual, turning over in his mind the memory of a small, quiet woman who had looked at him with more honesty in her eyes than any noble in that hall had managed all day. The open council hour began with shouting, and Lila had barely stepped into the chamber before she understood why the guards outside looked so tense. Two territory leaders stood on opposite sides of a long table, both slamming their palms against the wood as they argued over grazing rights along a disputed border. Their voices bounced off the stone walls, sharp and furious, while nearby nobles watched with the kind of eager interest people reserved for a fight they had no stake in. King Rowan sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, letting the argument run its course before finally raising a single hand. The room quieted, though the tension remained thick enough to feel against the skin. "You have both repeated the same accusations for the better part of an hour," Rowan said calmly. "I am still waiting for a solution rather than a complaint." One of the leaders, a broad man named Garrick, straightened his shoulders. "The land was granted to my pack 3 generations ago, my king. Their recent expansion violates old agreements." The opposing leader, a sharp-eyed woman named Ilara, scoffed. "Old agreements that were never properly recorded. We have grown, and growth requires space. This is simple." "Nothing about this is simple," Garrick snapped. Rowan exhaled slowly, glancing toward his advisors, none of whom seemed to offer anything beyond nervous silence. Lila, standing near the back wall where Colin had positioned her, watched the exchange with growing interest despite herself. She had read about border disputes before, back when she still had access to her father's small collection of old pack histories, kept hidden from Colin, who cared little for books. "There is an older record," Lila said quietly, more to herself than anyone else, but her voice carried further than she intended in the sudden lull of the argument. Every head turned toward her. Colin's face went pale with alarm, though Lila barely noticed him, too caught in the memory suddenly surfacing in her mind. She had read something years ago, buried in a dusty ledger, about regional boundary agreements, written before either family currently disputing this land had even claimed it. Rowan's gaze settled on her, sharp with curiosity rather than annoyance. "Speak clearly," he said. "What record?" Lila's heart pounded, but she forced herself to step forward rather than shrink back, as instinct demanded. There was an original boundary treaty, written before either pack claimed this land, filed under the old regional archive, rather than either family's personal records. If such a document still exists, it may settle the matter without further argument. Garrick frowned. "I have never heard of such a document. Because it predates your family's claim by nearly 30 years, Lila said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice now that the words had begun. "My father kept copies of several regional histories. I remember reading about a survey conducted before either territory expanded into contested space. If the original survey still exists in the Royal Archive, it would settle whose claim holds precedence, without either side needing to rely on memory or assumption." Silence stretched across the chamber. Rowan studied her for a long moment. Lila resisted the urge to look away. "You are certain such a record exists?" he asked. "I cannot promise it survived," Lila admitted honestly. "But if the Royal Archive keeps records from that era, it would be worth searching before this argument continues any further." Rowan turned to one of his advisors, an older man with silver hair. "Send someone to search the archive immediately. If such a survey exists, bring it before this council resumes tomorrow." The advisor bowed and hurried from the room, and the two feuding leaders exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unprepared for the argument to shift so suddenly onto solid ground rather than heated opinion. Rowan's attention returned to Lila. "What is your name?" "Lila," she answered, her voice small again, now that the moment of confidence had passed. "You are not a noble," he observed, though not unkindly. "No, my king. I am here with my stepbrother Colin, of the smaller Eastern holdings." Rowan's eyes flicked briefly toward Colin, who bowed deeply, his expression carefully arranged into practiced humility. "Interesting," Rowan said, though his tone suggested he was not entirely convinced by whatever performance Colin intended. He returned his attention to Lila. "You read old regional histories?" "When I could find them," she said. There was little else to occupy quiet evenings in a small village. Something shifted in Rowan's expression, an almost imperceptible softening around his eyes. "Knowledge like yours is rare in this hall," he said. "Most nobles concern themselves only with matters directly affecting their own holdings." Lila did not know how to respond to praise, having received so little of it in her life that she had no practiced reply prepared. She simply nodded, cheeks warming under the sudden attention of dozens of watching eyes. The council session continued through several more disputes, though none carried the same tension as the border argument. Lila remained near the back of the room, listening carefully, occasionally offering quiet observations when Colin nudged her forward, though she noticed he seemed increasingly pleased with the attention she had drawn, calculating how best to use it for his own advancement. When the session finally ended, Rowan requested a brief private conversation with several senior advisors, and the room slowly emptied of nobles and lesser attendees. Lila lingered near the doorway, uncertain whether she was meant to leave immediately or wait for some further instruction. Lila. She turned to find Rowan approaching, having dismissed his advisors for the moment. Colin, sensing opportunity, straightened immediately, though Rowan's attention remained fixed entirely on Lila. Your suggestion today may have prevented a conflict between two packs that has simmered for years, he said. I want to thank you properly, rather than simply acknowledging it in passing before the entire court. It was only a memory, Lila said, uncomfortable with the weight of his gratitude. I did nothing more than recall something I once read. Knowledge is not nothing, Rowan replied, especially knowledge others have forgotten or dismissed entirely. He studied her for a moment, something thoughtful crossing his expression. Tell me, does your stepbrother often bring you to these gatherings? Lila hesitated, aware of Colin standing close enough to hear every word. Occasionally, my king. And do you enjoy attending? The question caught her off guard, direct and unexpected in a way few people had ever bothered to ask her. She glanced briefly at Colin before answering carefully. I find the discussions interesting, when I am permitted to listen closely. Something in her tone must have revealed more than she intended, because Rowan's expression sharpened slightly, though he said nothing further on the matter in front of Colin. Instead, he addressed Colin directly. Your stepsister has a valuable mind. I would like her present during tomorrow's continued discussion, once the archive search returns results. Colin bowed low, delight barely concealed beneath his practiced humility. Of course, my king. It would be our honor. Rowan nodded once, before turning back toward his departing advisors, leaving Lila standing quietly in the emptying chamber, unsure whether she had just gained a small measure of respect within this palace, or simply handed Colin another tool to use against her. That evening, word of the council session spread quickly through the palace grounds. Servants whispered about the quiet woman, who had corrected two feuding nobles with nothing more than a memory of old family records. Some nobles regarded her with newfound curiosity when she passed through the corridors. Others regarded her with open suspicion, uncertain what to make of someone so unimportant suddenly earning the king's direct attention. Colin found her in the small garden behind the guest quarters, where she had gone seeking a moment of quiet away from the palace's constant movement. This is exactly the kind of opportunity I meant, he said, pride evident in his voice, for perhaps the first time in years. Though Lila understood immediately, it was pride in his own cleverness rather than in her. The king noticed you. Tomorrow, you will make yourself indispensable to him. I only remembered an old document, Lila said tiredly. That is not the same as being indispensable. It is exactly the same, Colin insisted. Kings surround themselves with useful people. If you become useful enough, our family gains protection, influence, perhaps even land of our own. Lila turned away from him, watching moonlight settle over the quiet garden. She thought of Rowan's question, asked so simply, yet with genuine curiosity, rather than obligation. Do you enjoy attending? No one had ever asked her that before, certainly not Colin, who saw her only as an instrument for his own advancement. She did not know what tomorrow's continued council session would bring, or whether the old survey would even be found within the royal archive. But she found herself hoping, quietly and cautiously, that whatever came next might offer her something beyond simply being useful to someone else's ambition. For the first time in longer than she could remember, someone in a position of real power had looked at her and seen not a burden, not an obligation, but a mind worth listening to. Whether that recognition would last beyond tomorrow's discussions remained entirely uncertain, but as she finally returned to her small guest chamber for the night, Lila allowed herself to hold on to that small, fragile hope a little longer than she probably should have. Sleep did not come easily that night. Lila lay awake listening to the distant sounds of the palace settling into darkness, servants finishing their final rounds, guards changing positions along the outer walls, the occasional murmur of laughter drifting from some gathering she was not part of. She thought about the way Rowan had looked at her during the council session, not with the polite disinterest most nobles offered her, but with genuine attention, as though her words carried weight simply because she had spoken them with care. She thought too of Garrick and Alara, the two feuding leaders whose dispute had nearly consumed the entire council hour, before her small memory had shifted everything. She wondered whether the old survey truly still existed somewhere in the royal archive, buried beneath decades of other records, waiting to be rediscovered. Her father had always been meticulous about preserving old documents, believing that history, however small or forgotten, held lessons worth remembering. Colin had mocked him for it more than once, calling it a waste of time better spent building alliances or securing wealth. Yet here she was, in a palace far grander than anything her father could have imagined, and the very habit he had passed down to her, quiet evenings spent reading dusty ledgers instead of attending village gatherings, had proven useful in front of a king. She wished, briefly and painfully, that her father had lived long enough to see it. Morning arrived with a soft knock at her door. A young servant, the same woman who had brought her food during the summit, informed her that the council session would resume within the hour, and that her presence had been specifically requested. Lila dressed quickly, choosing the least worn of her two traveling dresses, though she doubted anything she owned could compare to the fine fabrics worn by the nobles surrounding her daily. She smoothed her hair as best she could, and made her way toward the council chamber, her stomach tight with nervous anticipation. Colin met her outside the chamber doors, straightening her collar with quick, impatient hands. "Remember," he whispered. "Confidence, but not arrogance. Let him see your usefulness without seeming as though you seek his favor." Lila said nothing, though privately, she wondered if her stepbrother had ever considered that perhaps she did not seek anyone's favor at all, only a moment of peace, where she was not constantly measured against someone else's expectations. Inside the chamber, the silver-haired advisor stood near the head of the table, a thick, aged scroll unrolled carefully across the wooden surface. Rowan stood beside him, his expression unreadable, as he examined the faded ink and worn parchment. "It exists," the advisor confirmed as Lila entered, glancing up briefly. "Buried in the deepest section of the archive, exactly as the young woman suggested." Rowan looked up, his eyes finding Lila immediately across the room. "You were right," he said simply, though something in his voice carried more warmth than the words alone suggested. "The original survey predates both families' claims by nearly 3 decades, precisely as you remembered." Garrick and Alara, already seated at the table, exchanged uneasy glances as the advisor began reading through the ancient boundary lines recorded within the survey. Lila watched quietly from her position near the wall, relief settling through her chest, as the dispute that had threatened real conflict between two proud packs began resolving itself through evidence, rather than continued argument. By midday, both leaders had accepted the survey's findings, their dispute settled without further hostility. Rowan thanked them formally before dismissing the council for the day, and as the chamber slowly emptied, he once again sought Lila out directly. "You have done this kingdom a great service," he said quietly, away from the immediate crowd of departing nobles. "Twice now, in less than 2 days." "I only remembered a document," Lila repeated, though she found herself smiling slightly despite her usual caution. "Perhaps," Rowan said, "but knowledge means little without someone willing to speak it aloud, especially in a room full of people more interested in their own voices than the truth." He paused, studying her with quiet consideration. "I would like you to remain at the palace for the coming weeks, Lila. There is much unrest between packs that old records might help resolve, and I find myself in need of someone who understands history, rather than simply politics." Lila's breath caught. An invitation to remain, offered directly and without hesitation, was unlike anything she had ever expected to receive within these grand walls. She glanced toward Colin, who stood nearby with barely contained excitement at the prospect of extended palace access. "I would be honored, my king," Lila said carefully, though privately she wondered exactly what remaining at the palace might mean for her future, and whether the quiet respect she had glimpsed in Rowan's eyes would remain steady once the excitement of her small discoveries faded into the ordinary rhythm of palace life. The whispers started before Lila had finished her first full week at the palace. She heard them in the corridors, low voices trailing off whenever she passed too close, and caught fragments of conversation in the dining hall that stopped abruptly the moment servants noticed her presence. At first, she told herself she was imagining it, that exhaustion from her new responsibilities was making her paranoid, But by the 5th day, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. "She has bewitched him," one noblewoman murmured to another near the archive entrance, unaware that Lila stood just around the corner, holding a stack of old ledgers. How else does someone so plain earn the king's private attention within days of arriving? "Pity, more likely," the second woman replied. "Rowan always did have a soft heart for strays." Lila's fingers tightened around the ledgers in her hands, though she forced herself to walk past without acknowledging the conversation. She had learned long ago that reacting to cruelty only fed it further. Better to remain silent and let the words pass without giving them the satisfaction of a response. Still, the whispers followed her everywhere. In the training yard, where she sometimes walked in the early morning before her archive duties began, soldiers lowered their voices as she passed. In the dining hall, nobles who had once ignored her entirely now watched her with open suspicion, as though her sudden usefulness to the king represented some hidden threat to their own standing. Colin, predictably, found the entire situation amusing rather than concerning. "Let them talk," he said one evening, finding her in the small study, where she had begun organizing decades of neglected regional records. "Every rumor only increases your value. The more they whisper about your closeness to the king, the more other nobles will believe an alliance with our family holds real weight." "They believe I am manipulating him," Lila said quietly, setting down the ledger she had been reading. "That is not the same as value, Colin. That is danger." "Danger and opportunity often wear the same face," Colin replied, unbothered. "Continue proving your usefulness. Let the rumors sort themselves out." Lila said nothing further, though privately, she worried that her stepbrother's ambition blinded him to the very real risk building around her. Nobles with wounded pride and threatened positions did not simply let rumors fade quietly. She had seen enough of court politics during her short time at the palace to understand that reputation, once tarnished, rarely repaired itself easily. The following morning brought the matter to a head far sooner than she expected. She had been summoned to assist with translating an old regional treaty, one of several documents Rowan hoped might help settle another simmering dispute between neighboring territories. The work required quiet concentration, and she had claimed a small table near the archive's western window, surrounded by scrolls and reference texts. She did not notice the group of nobles entering until their voices grew loud enough to break her focus. "Word has it, the king consults her more than his own senior advisors now," one noble said, his voice carrying deliberately across the room. He was tall, with sharp features and an expensive coat that marked him as someone of considerable standing. Lila recognized him vaguely from the summit, though she did not know his name. Strange, considering she holds no title, no lands, nothing beyond whatever small trick she used to worm her way into his favor. Another added, a woman with cold eyes, who glanced pointedly toward Lila's table. Lila kept her gaze fixed on the scroll before her, though her hands had gone still, unable to continue the delicate translation work, while every word aimed in her direction landed like a small blow. "Perhaps she offers him something beyond old documents," the first noble said, his tone dripping with implication that made Lila's stomach turn cold. The words hung in the air, cruel and deliberate, clearly meant to be overheard. Lila felt heat rise in her cheeks, humiliation and anger tangling together, in a way she had rarely experienced so intensely. She wanted to respond, to defend herself, but years of practiced silence held her tongue in place. She did not hear the door open behind her. "I would advise choosing your next words very carefully." Rowan's voice cut through the chamber like cold water, and the group of nobles turned sharply, their confident postures collapsing instantly into nervous uncertainty. Lila looked up as well, surprised to find him standing just inside the archive entrance, his expression carrying a controlled anger she had not yet witnessed from him during her time at the palace. "My king," the sharp-featured noble stammered, bowing quickly. "We meant no disrespect." "You meant precisely the disrespect your words carried," Rowan replied, his voice low but unmistakably sharp. "I have tolerated a great deal of gossip since taking this throne, understanding that nobles enjoy little else beyond speculation about matters that do not concern them. But I will not tolerate baseless accusations against someone who has done nothing beyond offer this kingdom valuable service." The woman with cold eyes lowered her gaze, though Lila noticed her jaw remained tight with barely concealed resentment rather than genuine remorse. "Lila's knowledge has resolved 2 potential conflicts within the span of a single week," Rowan continued, addressing the small gathering directly. If any of you possess similar expertise regarding regional treaties and forgotten boundary agreements, I welcome your contribution as well. Until then, I suggest directing your energy toward matters that actually serve this kingdom, rather than manufacturing scandal from simple competence. No one spoke. The silence stretched long enough that Lila felt almost as uncomfortable as the nobles clearly did, unaccustomed to being defended so directly and publicly. "You may leave," Rowan said finally, and the group departed quickly, murmuring quiet apologies that carried little sincerity behind them. Once the archive had emptied of unwanted visitors, Rowan turned his attention to Lila, his expression softening considerably from the controlled fury he had displayed moments earlier. "Are you well?" he asked, his voice gentler now. Lila nodded, though her hands still trembled slightly from the encounter. "I am accustomed to unkind words, my king. It is not the first time I have been dismissed for reasons beyond my control." "That does not make it acceptable," Rowan said firmly. "Nor should you have to grow accustomed to cruelty simply because it has followed you throughout your life." Lila glanced up at him, surprised by the directness of his statement. Something about the way he spoke, without hesitation or careful political phrasing, suggested genuine conviction, rather than obligation, toward fairness expected of a king. "May I ask you something, my king?" she ventured carefully. "You may." "Why do you defend me so readily? I hold no title, no influence beyond what you have recently offered me. Most in my position would expect to be discarded the moment they became inconvenient, rather than protected." Rowan considered the question seriously, his gaze steady on hers. "Because inconvenience and worthlessness are not the same thing," he said finally. "I have watched countless nobles surround this throne throughout my life, each one concerned primarily with their own advancement, rarely offering anything of genuine value, beyond flattery and calculated loyalty. You have offered this kingdom real solutions within days of arriving, expecting nothing in return beyond simple acknowledgement of your effort. That is rare enough to protect." Lila did not know how to respond to such honesty, unaccustomed to receiving explanations rather than simple commands or dismissals. She lowered her gaze slightly, uncertain what to say. "Continue your work," Rowan said finally, stepping back toward the archive entrance. "And Lila, should anyone else speak to you in such a manner, you need not endure it silently. You may report such behavior directly to me, regardless of the hour." "Thank you, my king," she said quietly, watching him depart with a strange warmth settling in her chest that she did not fully understand. That evening, word of Rowan's public defense spread through the palace, even faster than the original rumors had. Some nobles grew quieter around her, uncertain how openly they could continue their whispered speculation, now that the king had made his position clear. Others grew more resentful, viewing his protection as further proof that something unusual bound the king to this quiet, unremarkable woman from the Eastern Holdings. Colin found the entire situation deeply satisfying, though Lila noticed a new sharpness in his calculations, a hunger that had not existed before Rowan's public defense had elevated her standing so visibly within the court. "This changes everything," he said that night, pacing the small study, where Lila continued her translation work late into the evening. "The king himself silenced nobles on your behalf. Do you understand what that means?" "It means he values honesty and fairness," Lila said simply, though she suspected Colin heard something entirely different in the king's actions, something involving opportunity and advancement rather than simple decency. "It means our family's position within this court has shifted considerably," Colin corrected, his eyes bright with ambition. "We must be careful now, more careful than ever, to ensure this advantage is not wasted." Lila said nothing further, returning her attention to the ancient treaty before her, though privately she wondered how long her stepbrother's schemes could continue before they collided directly with whatever quiet, genuine respect had begun growing between herself and the king who ruled this increasingly complicated kingdom. Colin left the study eventually, still muttering calculations under his breath, and Lila remained alone with the flickering candlelight and the fragile, ancient parchment spread across the table. She read the treaty slowly, careful not to damage the brittle edges, tracing the faded ink with gentle fingers as she pieced together boundary lines drawn generations before she was born. Her mind, however, kept drifting back to the archive, to the cold eyes of the noblewoman and the deliberate cruelty in the sharp-featured noble's voice. She had endured unkind words for most of her life, Yet something about hearing them here, in a place where she had begun to feel a small measure of belonging, cut deeper than she expected. She thought about what Rowan had said, that inconvenience and worthlessness were not the same thing. It was such a simple statement, yet no one had ever framed her existence in quite those terms before. Colin had always treated her as a burden to be managed, a debt to be collected on eventually. Even kind villagers back home had regarded her small stature with a kind of gentle pity, as though her size were something to be endured, rather than simply a fact about her, no different from the color of her eyes or the texture of her hair. Rowan's words offered something different entirely. Not pity, not obligation, but genuine recognition of value, freely given, rather than owed. She wondered if she was foolish to hold on to such words so tightly, especially given how recently she had arrived at this palace, how little she truly understood about the political currents swirling beneath every conversation, every alliance, every carefully worded compliment offered by nobles who wanted something in return. Perhaps Rowan's defense had been nothing more than a king protecting the reputation of his own council, ensuring that baseless gossip did not undermine confidence in his judgment, for elevating an unknown woman to a position of temporary usefulness. Yet something in his eyes when he had asked if she was well suggested a concern that extended beyond simple political calculation. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to find the same young servant who had brought her food during the summit, standing in the doorway with a small tray of tea and warm bread. "The hour grows late," the servant said kindly. "I thought you might need something before continuing your work." "Thank you," Lila said, accepting the tray gratefully. "You are very kind to think of me." The servant smiled, setting the tray down carefully. "May I speak freely, my lady?" Lila blinked at the unfamiliar title, though she nodded, curious, despite the strangeness of being addressed with such formality. "Of course. The kitchen staff have noticed the whispers as well," the servant said quietly. "Many of us do not believe the rumors nobles spread about you. Some of us understand what it means to be underestimated, simply because we were not born into wealth or title. Your presence here has given several of us hope that perhaps merit still matters within these walls, even for those born without privilege." Lila felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest at the servant's words, a kindness offered without any expectation of reward or recognition. "Thank you for telling me that," she said sincerely. "I did not realize anyone beyond the king had noticed anything positive in my presence here." "Many notice more than they say aloud," the servant replied, offering a small, knowing smile before quietly excusing herself from the study. Lila sat alone once more, sipping the warm tea slowly as she considered the servant's words. Perhaps she had been too focused on the cruelty of nobles and the calculating ambition of her own stepbrother to notice the quieter kindnesses extended toward her by those who understood, better than anyone, what it meant to be dismissed simply for lacking wealth or title. She returned to her translation work with renewed focus, determined to prove, through steady and genuine effort, that whatever value Rowan had recognized in her was not imagined, nor was it dependent on rumor or gossip to remain true. If nobles wished to whisper about manipulation and hidden motives, she would answer their cruelty with nothing more than continued competence and quiet dignity, the same qualities that had carried her through every difficult year of her life, long before she ever set foot within these grand palace walls. By the time she finally extinguished her candle and retired for the night, the ancient treaty lay fully translated on the table before her, ready for tomorrow's council session, and Lila allowed herself, for just a moment, to feel something resembling genuine pride in her own quiet, careful work. The messenger arrived at dawn, his horse lathered with sweat, carrying news that sent the entire palace into immediate motion. Lila woke to the sound of hurried footsteps in the corridor outside her chamber, voices calling out urgent instructions, doors slamming as servants rushed between rooms. She dressed quickly, uncertain what crisis had disrupted the palace so suddenly, and made her way toward the main hall where a crowd had already gathered. "The Vasari territory demands renegotiation of the Northern Treaty," one advisor was explaining, as Rowan stood at the center of the gathered crowd, his expression grim. "They threaten war if their claims are not addressed within 2 weeks. Lila's stomach tightened. She had heard whispers about the Vasari Pact during her weeks at the palace, a proud and powerful territory, known for aggressive expansion, and a leadership eager to test the young king's resolve. "What claims?" Rowan asked, his voice steady despite the tension visible in his shoulders. They insist the original treaty, signed under your father's rule, unfairly restricted their access to shared hunting grounds, the advisor explained. They demand full renegotiation, or they will consider the treaty void entirely, opening the border to conflict. Rowan's jaw tightened. Bring me the original treaty documents immediately. Servants scattered to retrieve the requested records, and Lila found herself standing quietly near the edge of the gathered crowd, uncertain whether her presence was welcome during a crisis of this magnitude. She had proven useful, with minor disputes and forgotten surveys, but a potential war between powerful territories felt like an entirely different matter, one far beyond her modest contributions. Yet when the treaty documents arrived, ancient and covered in complex legal language that clearly confused several senior advisors, Rowan's eyes found her across the crowded hall. "Lila," he called, his voice carrying easily. "Come forward." She stepped through the parting crowd, aware of curious and suspicious glances following her movement, and approached the table where the treaty had been unrolled. "Can you make sense of this language?" Rowan asked, gesturing toward the dense legal text. "My advisors disagree on its exact meaning, and I need clarity before responding to Vasari's demands." Lila studied the document carefully, recognizing the archaic legal phrasing common to treaties signed generations earlier, similar to texts she had studied extensively during her quiet evenings at home. "The language here specifies shared access during migration seasons only," she said slowly, tracing the relevant passage with her finger. "Vasari's claim to full access year-round contradicts the original agreement directly. However, there is an older provision here, referencing a secondary agreement, negotiated separately, that may grant additional rights during specific circumstances." "What circumstances?" Rowan asked, leaning closer to examine the passage she indicated. "Drought conditions," Lila explained. "If the region experienced sustained drought, the original treaty permitted expanded access as a temporary measure, meant to prevent unnecessary conflict during resource scarcity." Rowan exchanged a glance with his silver-haired advisor, both men clearly considering the implications of this discovery. "Has the region experienced drought recently?" Rowan asked. "Not according to recent reports," the advisor confirmed. "Rainfall has remained consistent throughout the northern territories this past year." "Then Vasari's demand for full renegotiation has no legal foundation," Rowan said, his expression sharpening with renewed confidence. "Their claim relies entirely on manufactured urgency, rather than genuine treaty violation." Lila nodded, though a flicker of concern crossed her mind. "Even without legal foundation, my king, a territory determined to expand its influence, may not care whether their claim holds merit. If Vasari intends war regardless of the treaty's actual terms, this discovery alone may not prevent conflict." Rowan studied her for a long moment, clearly considering the weight of her observation. "You believe they seek conflict regardless of legal standing?" "I cannot know their true intentions," Lila admitted. "But territories confident in their military strength sometimes use treaty disputes as convenient justification for aggression they intended regardless of the actual agreement's terms." The silver-haired advisor frowned deeply. "A troubling possibility, my king, though not one we can easily verify." Rowan straightened, his expression settling into the calm, calculated determination Lila had witnessed during the earlier border dispute. "Then we will respond with both legal clarity and appropriate caution," he said. "Prepare a formal delegation to travel toward the Vasari border, presenting the original treaty terms directly to their leadership. If they intend genuine negotiation, this will resolve the matter peacefully. If they seek conflict regardless, we will at least understand their true intentions before committing further resources." "Who will lead this delegation?" the advisor asked. Rowan's gaze returned to Lila, and something in his expression made her breath catch slightly. "I will lead it myself," he said, "and I want Lila present, given her clear understanding of these ancient legal texts. Should Vasari's leadership attempt to twist the treaty's meaning during negotiation, I will need someone capable of countering their claims with precise knowledge." Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd, surprise and skepticism evident on many faces. Colin, standing near the back of the hall, looked simultaneously thrilled and anxious at this unexpected elevation of his stepsister's role within such a dangerous diplomatic mission. "My king," one senior noble interjected, his tone carefully respectful but clearly concerned. "Surely a more experienced advisor would better serve this delicate negotiation. The young woman, however capable with historical documents, lacks experience in diplomatic confrontation. She possesses knowledge my senior advisors lack, Rowan replied firmly, his tone leaving little room for further argument. Experience in diplomatic confrontation matters little if the underlying legal understanding is flawed. I trust Lila's judgment regarding these documents, and I intend to bring her along specifically because of that trust. The noble bowed, though his expression remained troubled, and Lila noticed similar uncertainty reflected on several other faces throughout the hall. She understood their concern, even shared it privately. She had never participated in anything resembling formal diplomatic negotiation, let alone one carrying the weight of potential war between powerful territories. Yet Rowan's confidence in her, expressed so directly before the entire court, settled something within her chest, despite her nervousness. He had chosen her deliberately, trusting her understanding over the accumulated experience of advisors who had served the crown for decades. Later that evening, as preparations for the journey continued throughout the palace, Lila found herself standing alone near the western courtyard, watching soldiers load supplies onto waiting horses. The weight of tomorrow's departure pressed heavily against her thoughts, uncertainty tangling with a strange, unfamiliar determination she had rarely experienced so strongly before. You seem troubled. She turned to find Rowan approaching, having apparently sought her out deliberately, rather than encountering her by chance. I am concerned I may fail you, my king, she admitted honestly. This mission carries far greater weight than anything I have contributed thus far. You will not fail me, Rowan said with quiet certainty. I chose you because your knowledge is genuine, not performative. Vasari's leadership will attempt to manipulate the treaty's language to justify their aggression. I need someone beside me who understands the truth well enough to counter their distortions immediately, without hesitation. And if they refuse to accept the truth regardless of evidence? Lila asked. Rowan's expression grew more serious. Then we will understand their true intentions clearly, and prepare accordingly. Either outcome serves this kingdom better than continued uncertainty. Lila considered his words carefully, drawing strength from the steady confidence in his voice. Thank you for trusting me with this responsibility, she said finally. I will do everything within my ability to ensure the truth of these documents is understood clearly. That is all I ask, Rowan said, offering a small, genuine smile that eased some of the tension from her shoulders. Rest well tonight, Lila. Tomorrow's journey will demand considerable strength, and I suspect you possess far more of it than you currently realize. As he departed, Lila remained in the courtyard a while longer, watching torchlight flicker against the darkening sky, considering the strange path that had brought her from a small, overlooked village to standing at the center of a diplomatic mission that might determine whether two powerful territories descended into war. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time since arriving at this palace, she felt something beyond simple survival driving her forward. She felt genuinely needed, trusted for her mind, rather than dismissed for her size. And that feeling, however uncertain the road ahead remained, gave her more courage than she had known she possessed. Colin found her still standing in the courtyard, as the last of the supply horses were led away toward the stables for the night. His expression carried an unfamiliar mixture of pride and unease, as though he could not quite decide whether her sudden importance served his ambitions or threatened to spiral beyond his control entirely. You are traveling with the king himself, he said, his voice low. Do you understand what this means for our family's standing? I understand it means a great deal of responsibility, Lila replied evenly, and very little to do with our family's standing, Colin. This is about preventing a war, not advancing anyone's position at court. Everything at court is about advancing position, Colin said, though there was less conviction in his voice than usual. Still, be careful. Vasari's leadership has a reputation for ruthlessness. This is not a border dispute between minor packs squabbling over grazing land. I am aware, Lila said quietly. That is precisely why I intend to be as prepared as possible. Colin studied her for a moment, something almost like genuine concern flickering across his features, before his usual calculating expression returned. Do not let your usefulness make you careless, he said finally. A king's favor is valuable, but it is not protection against an enemy who wants war, regardless of what any treaty says. For once, Lila found herself agreeing with her stepbrother's caution. even if his motives remained tangled in ambition rather than genuine care for her safety. She nodded, watching him retreat toward the guest quarters, and turned her attention back toward the ancient treaty documents she had tucked carefully inside her satchel, determined to review every relevant clause once more before sleep finally claimed her. That night, she barely slept at all. She lay awake, reviewing the treaty's language in her mind, anticipating every possible argument the Vasari delegation might raise, preparing counterpoints rooted firmly in the document's actual wording rather than convenient interpretation. She thought of Rowan's steady confidence, his insistence that her knowledge was genuine rather than performative, and found herself determined not to disappoint the trust he had placed in her so publicly before the entire court. When dawn finally broke over the palace grounds, Lila rose before the first bell, dressed in sturdy traveling clothes suited for the long journey ahead, and made her way toward the courtyard, where the delegation had begun assembling. Soldiers checked their equipment methodically, advisors reviewed final preparations, and horses stamped restlessly in the cool morning air, sensing the tension that hung over the entire company. Rowan emerged from the palace shortly after, dressed not in ceremonial finery, but in practical armor suited for travel through potentially hostile territory. He surveyed the assembled delegation with careful attention before his gaze settled on Lila, standing slightly apart from the soldiers and senior advisors. "Ready?" he asked simply. "As ready as I can be, my king," she answered honestly. "That is all any of us can offer," Rowan said, something like reassurance coloring his tone. He gestured toward a horse prepared specifically for her use, gentler in temperament than the war horses ridden by soldiers. "We depart within the hour. The journey to the Vasari border will take 3 days if the weather holds." Lila nodded, mounting the horse with careful concentration, unaccustomed to long journeys on horseback, despite her rural upbringing. As the delegation finally began moving through the palace gates and onto the winding road leading north, she glanced back briefly at the towering walls she had called home for barely 2 weeks, uncertain what awaited them at the end of this journey, but resolved to meet whatever challenges arose with the same quiet determination that had carried her through every difficult moment of her life thus far. The first day of travel passed with little conversation, the company moving steadily through forested hills and open farmland, soldiers maintaining careful watch along the roadside while advisors discussed logistics in low, focused voices. Lila rode near the middle of the procession, close enough to Rowan that she could occasionally hear him conferring quietly with his senior guard about the route ahead, yet far enough that she did not feel obligated to fill every silence with unnecessary conversation. By evening, the company made camp beside a wide stream, tents raised quickly by soldiers well practiced in the routine of travel. Lila found herself seated near a small fire, reviewing the treaty documents once more by firelight, when Rowan approached and settled across from her without invitation. "You study those pages as though you expect them to change overnight," he observed, a faint trace of amusement in his voice. "I would rather know every possible interpretation before facing Vasari's delegation than discover a weakness in my understanding during the negotiation itself," Lila replied, not looking up from the parchment. "A wise approach," Rowan agreed, settling more comfortably by the fire. "Though I suspect you already know this treaty better than any advisor within my court." Lila finally glanced up, meeting his gaze across the flickering flames. "I hope that proves true when it matters most." "It will," Rowan said simply, with a certainty that eased some of the anxious tightness in her chest. They sat together in companionable silence for a while longer, the crackling fire and distant murmur of soldiers settling into their own conversations, the only sounds beneath the darkening sky, before Lila finally returned to her tent, treaty pages safely tucked away, ready to face whatever the following days of travel would bring. The attack came without warning, as the delegation crossed a narrow pass between 2 steep hillsides, the exact location where a road offered no room to maneuver, and thick trees on either side provided perfect cover for anyone waiting to strike. Lila heard the first shout before she fully understood what was happening, a soldier near the front of the procession, calling out a warning that dissolved almost immediately into chaos. Arrows whistled through the air from the tree line, and her horse reared in panic as the entire company scattered into defensive positions. "Down!" Rowan's voice cut through the confusion, and Lila felt strong hands pulling her from her horse, just as an arrow struck the saddle where she had been sitting moments before. She hit the ground hard, Rowan's body shielding hers, as more arrows rained down around them. Soldiers shouted orders. Steel rang against steel, as the delegation's guards moved to intercept the ambushers now emerging from the trees, and Lila's heart pounded so violently she could barely process the danger surrounding them. "Stay low," Rowan instructed, his voice remarkably calm despite the chaos. "We need to reach cover behind those rocks." Lila nodded, following his lead, as he guided her carefully across the exposed road, toward a cluster of large boulders, providing partial shelter from the ongoing assault. Around them, the delegation's guards fought fiercely against attackers wearing no identifying colors, their faces partially concealed, clearly intent on ensuring no survivors could identify their origin. "Who are they?" Lila gasped, pressing herself against the cold stone. "I don't know," Rowan admitted, his eyes scanning the chaos with sharp focus. "But this was planned. They knew our route, our timing. Someone informed them of our travel plans." The implications settled heavily over Lila, despite the immediate danger surrounding them. Only a small circle of people had known the delegation's exact route and schedule, information that should have remained carefully guarded within the palace's inner circle. A group of attackers broke through the delegation's defensive line, moving directly toward their position behind the boulders. Rowan drew his sword immediately, positioning himself between Lila and the approaching threat. "Stay behind me," he commanded. Lila's mind raced, searching desperately for any way to help, beyond simply cowering behind the rocks, while others fought for their lives. Her eyes fell on the satchel still strapped across her shoulder, containing not just the treaty documents but also a small collection of tools she had brought for reviewing ancient texts, including a sturdy metal stylus used for tracing faded ink. As one attacker rounded the boulder, weapon raised, Lila acted on pure instinct, throwing a handful of loose gravel directly into his eyes. The man stumbled, momentarily blinded, giving Rowan the opening he needed to disarm him swiftly. "Clever," Rowan said breathlessly, though his attention remained fixed on the ongoing battle surrounding them. More attackers pressed forward, and Lila noticed something the chaos had obscured until now. The ambushers seemed to be deliberately pushing the delegation's guards away from Rowan's position, isolating him, rather than attacking the group as a whole. "They want you specifically," she realized aloud, her voice tight with sudden understanding. "This isn't a random ambush. They're trying to separate you from your soldiers." Rowan's expression darkened as he processed her observation, recognizing the truth in her words, even as another attacker lunged toward them. He met the strike with practiced skill, his blade finding its mark before the man could recover his balance. "If that's true," Rowan said, breathing hard between exchanges, "we need to reach my guards before they can complete whatever plan this represents." Lila scanned the chaotic battlefield, searching for any path that might lead them back toward the main body of soldiers without exposing them further to the attackers clearly focused on Rowan's position. She spotted a narrow gap between two fallen trees, offering partial cover that might allow them to circle back toward safety. "There," she said, pointing quickly. "If we move along that fallen trunk, we can reach your soldiers without crossing open ground." Rowan glanced at the path she indicated, nodding sharply. "Stay close behind me." They moved together, Rowan cutting through the chaos with controlled precision, while Lila followed as closely as she dared, her heart hammering with each step. An attacker emerged suddenly from behind the fallen trees, weapon already swinging toward Rowan's unprotected side. Lila reacted without thinking, grabbing a heavy branch from the ground and swinging it with all her strength directly into the attacker's knee. The man crumpled with a pained cry, giving Rowan just enough time to finish the exchange before more threats emerged. "You continue to surprise me," Rowan said, genuine astonishment coloring his voice despite the ongoing danger. "I have no intention of dying quietly while others fight for me," Lila replied, adrenaline steadying her voice despite the trembling in her hands. They finally broke through to where Rowan's soldiers had regrouped, having successfully repelled the majority of the ambush once reinforcements from the rear of the procession arrived to bolster their numbers. The remaining attackers, seeing their advantage lost, began retreating into the surrounding forest, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. The aftermath revealed a grim scene. Several soldiers lay wounded, though miraculously none had been killed outright. Rowan moved immediately among his guards, checking injuries and issuing calm instructions for treatment and continued vigilance, while Lila stood slightly apart, her body finally beginning to shake as the adrenaline of the encounter faded into raw shock. "You did well," Rowan said, returning to her side, once the immediate crisis had settled into organized recovery. "More than well. You may have saved my life back there." "I only reacted," Lila said, her voice unsteady. "I did not think through any of it." "Sometimes the best instincts require no thinking at all," Rowan replied, his eyes studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch, despite the exhaustion weighing on her body. "Are you injured?" Lila checked herself quickly, finding only minor scrapes from the fall earlier in the encounter. "I am well, my king. Are you?" "Nothing serious," he assured her, though she noticed a shallow cut along his forearm that he seemed determined to ignore, in favor of ensuring his soldiers received attention first. As the delegation began the difficult process of treating wounds and reassessing their journey, Rowan's silver-haired advisor approached with a grim expression. "My king, this attack was clearly premeditated. Someone provided information regarding our exact route." "I am aware," Rowan said, his voice hardening. "We will investigate once we return to the palace. For now, our priority remains reaching Vasari's border safely, or determining whether this attack originated from their territory directly." Lila's mind raced through the implications of everything she had witnessed. If someone within the palace had leaked their travel plans, the circle of suspects remained painfully small, limited to those who had known the delegation's exact timing and route before their departure. She thought uneasily of Colin's calculating ambition, though she pushed the thought aside quickly, unwilling to entertain suspicion toward her own stepbrother without clear evidence. As evening settled over the makeshift camp established for treating the wounded and reassessing their strategy, Rowan found Lila sitting alone near the edge of the clearing, still processing the day's violence. "Thank you," he said quietly, settling beside her. "For your quick thinking today. I do not believe I would have escaped that ambush as easily without your observations." "You would have found another way," Lila said, though warmth spread through her chest at his sincere gratitude. "You are far more skilled in battle than I could ever hope to be." "Skill matters little without clarity," Rowan replied. "You saw what my soldiers, focused entirely on combat, failed to notice. That clarity may have saved considerably more than just my life today." They sat together in silence for a while, the weight of the day's violence settling heavily between them, though something else lingered as well, a fragile new understanding neither of them fully acknowledged aloud. Lila glanced sideways at Rowan, noticing the exhaustion evident in his posture, despite his continued composure, and felt an unfamiliar protectiveness stir within her chest, entirely at odds with her usual quiet reserve. Tomorrow would bring continued travel toward Vasari's border, and with it, uncertain danger neither of them could fully predict. But tonight, sitting together beneath a darkening sky following violence neither had expected to survive so narrowly, Lila found herself grateful, simply for the quiet presence beside her, and the strange, growing trust that had settled between them despite everything working against it. "May I ask you something, my king?" Lila said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "Of course. Does this happen often? Attacks against you? I mean, hidden threats, disguised as ordinary travel." Rowan considered the question carefully before answering. "More often than I would like. My father faced similar dangers throughout his reign, though he rarely spoke of them openly. Ruling a territory as large as ours invites enemies, both visible and hidden, who believe removing a king serves their ambitions better than honest negotiation." "That sounds like an exhausting way to live," Lila said quietly. "It is," Rowan admitted, a rare note of vulnerability entering his voice. "Though I have grown accustomed to constant vigilance since taking the throne. What troubles me more than the attack itself is the certainty that someone within my own circle provided the information necessary to plan it so precisely." Lila's chest tightened at the implication. "You believe someone close to you betrayed your trust?" "I believe someone close enough to know our exact travel plans shared that knowledge with people willing to use it for violence," Rowan clarified. "Whether that betrayal came from malice or simple carelessness remains to be discovered." They fell quiet again, the weight of unspoken suspicion settling between them. Lila thought once more of Colin, of his constant calculations and hunger for advancement, and felt a cold unease she could not fully dismiss, no matter how much she wished to trust her stepbrother's loyalty, however flawed his methods of expressing care for her might be. "Whatever the truth," Rowan said finally, breaking the heavy silence, "I do not intend to let fear dictate how I lead this kingdom. Tomorrow, we continue toward Vasari's border, prepared but undeterred. "I will be ready," Lila said, drawing strength from his steady resolve, despite her own lingering fear. Rowan studied her for a long moment in the flickering firelight, something unspoken passing between them that neither seemed willing to name directly. "Rest now," he said finally, rising to check once more on his wounded soldiers before retiring for the night. "Tomorrow will demand everything we have." Lila watched him go, the ache of exhaustion finally catching up with her fully now that the immediate danger had passed, and found herself, despite everything, looking forward to whatever the following day might bring, standing beside a king who had trusted her instincts enough to survive violence neither of them had anticipated. Sleep came slowly that night, interrupted often by the memory of arrows splitting the air, and the desperate scramble for cover. When Lila finally woke to gray morning light filtering through her tent, her body ached in places she had not expected, bruises forming along her arms and knees from the previous day's chaos. Outside, the camp had already stirred into quiet, efficient motion. Soldiers checked their wounded companions one final time before the group prepared to continue its journey, while others scouted the surrounding hillsides for any sign that the attackers might return. Lila emerged from her tent to find Rowan already awake, speaking in low tones with his silver-haired advisor near the remains of last night's fire. "The wounded are stable enough to continue," the advisor was saying as she approached, "though I recommend increased caution along the remaining stretch of road." "Double the forward scouts," Rowan instructed. "I want no repeat of yesterday's surprise." He turned as Lila joined them, his expression softening slightly, despite the seriousness of the conversation. "You slept?" "Little," she admitted honestly. "Though enough to continue, I think." "That will have to be enough for all of us," Rowan said, a faint, tired smile touching his features before the gravity of their situation reasserted itself. He glanced toward the horses being prepared for departure, then back to Lila. "We have perhaps 2 more days of travel before reaching Vasari's border. I would understand if yesterday's events made you wish to return to the palace instead." Lila considered his words carefully, surprised that he would offer her an escape from danger even now, after everything they had endured together. "I did not come this far, only to turn back the moment the road became difficult," she said finally. "If Vasari's leadership intends to twist the treaty's meaning to justify aggression, I would rather stand beside you when that confrontation occurs, than wonder from the safety of the palace whether my knowledge might have made a difference." Something shifted in Rowan's expression, a quiet admiration he did not bother concealing. "Then let us continue," he said, "together." The delegation moved out shortly after, the mood considerably more subdued than the confident procession that had departed the palace only 2 days earlier. Soldiers rode with weapons drawn now, scanning the tree lines with wary vigilance, while Lila kept the treaty documents close against her chest, determined that whatever awaited them at Vasari's border, she would be prepared to meet it with the same clarity of mind that had carried her through yesterday's violence. Vasari's border came into view on the 3rd day of travel, marked by a wide river crossing and a fortified outpost where the territory's leadership had agreed to meet the delegation for formal negotiation. The meeting hall inside the outpost was smaller than Lila expected, plain stone walls without the grandeur of the palace she had grown accustomed to, though the tension within the room felt no less significant. Vasari's leader, an older alpha named Corwin, sat across a wide table flanked by his own advisors, his expression carefully neutral as Rowan and his delegation took their places opposite him. "You have traveled far to tell me my claim holds no merit," Corwin said, his voice gravelly with age, but sharp with challenge. "I hope you bring more than simple denial, King Rowan." "I bring the original treaty, signed by your own predecessor," Rowan replied evenly, gesturing for Lila to unroll the ancient document across the table. "Its terms are clear, regarding seasonal access, rather than the permanent expansion your recent demands suggest." Corwin's eyes narrowed as he studied the parchment, though Lila suspected he understood the legal language only partially, relying instead on advisors murmuring quietly at his side. "Old documents can be interpreted many ways," he said finally, echoing exactly the kind of manipulation Rowan had feared during their journey north. "There is little room for alternate interpretation here," Lila said carefully, stepping forward despite the intimidating weight of Corwin's attention shifting toward her. "The clause specifies migration seasons explicitly, and further clarifies exceptions only during verified drought conditions, none of which apply to the current circumstances in your territory." Corwin studied her for a long moment, clearly surprised that someone so young and unassuming would speak with such confidence in a room full of powerful leaders. You claim expertise in ancient legal language, girl? I claim only careful reading, my lord, Lila replied, keeping her voice steady despite the condescension in his tone. The document speaks for itself, if one takes the time to understand its actual wording, rather than the interpretation most convenient to present circumstances. One of Corwin's advisors leaned forward, attempting to argue an alternate reading of the clause, but Lila countered each point methodically, citing precedent from similar agreements negotiated between other territories during the same historical period. Rowan remained largely silent throughout this exchange, allowing her expertise to speak clearly for itself, though Lila noticed the quiet pride evident in his expression as she dismantled every attempt at manipulation the Vasari advisors presented. By the negotiation's end, Corwin had accepted the treaty's clear language, agreeing to withdraw his territory's aggressive demands in exchange for a formal review of resource allocation during future drought conditions. No war would come from this dispute, and the delegation began its return journey toward the palace with considerably lighter hearts than the tense procession that had traveled north days earlier. The journey home passed without further incident, soldiers maintaining heightened vigilance throughout, though no attackers emerged from the surrounding forests this time. Lila found herself riding closer to Rowan during these final days of travel, their earlier formality gradually softening into something more comfortable, more genuine. You handled Corwin's questions beautifully, Rowan said one evening, as they shared a quiet meal away from the rest of the camp. He is known for testing the resolve of anyone who negotiates with him, searching for weakness in unprepared opponents. I studied that treaty until I could recite every clause from memory, Lila admitted. I did not want to disappoint the trust you placed in me. You never could have disappointed me, Rowan said, his voice carrying an unexpected warmth. Even before this journey, I recognized something rare in you, Lila. A mind that values truth over convenience, and courage that exists despite constant underestimation, rather than because of confidence others gave you. Lila glanced up, surprised by the depth of his observation. Few people have ever looked closely enough to notice such things. Then few people were paying proper attention, Rowan replied simply. They fell into comfortable silence, the crackling campfire between them, casting warm light across features growing increasingly familiar to each other, with every passing day. Lila found herself studying Rowan's expression, the way exhaustion and responsibility had carved subtle lines around his eyes, despite his relative youth, the quiet burden he carried without complaint, despite its evident weight. May I ask you something personal, my king? She ventured. You may, though I would prefer you simply call me Rowan when we are not surrounded by formal court. The request warmed something in her chest. Rowan, then, she said carefully, testing the informality. Do you ever resent the responsibility that fell to you so suddenly? Your father's passing, the throne, all of it arriving before you were fully prepared. Rowan considered the question seriously, staring into the fire for a long moment before answering. Resent is not quite the right word, he said finally. I mourn the time I did not have to prepare. The guidance my father might have offered had circumstances been different, but resentment implies wishing things were otherwise, and I have learned that wishing changes nothing. I simply carry what has been given to me, as best I can, every single day. That sounds lonely, Lila said softly. It was, Rowan admitted, until recently. Something in his tone made her breath catch, though she did not press further, uncertain what exactly he meant by the admission, or whether she was prepared to hear an answer that might shift the careful balance developing between them. What about you? Rowan asked, turning the conversation toward her instead. Tell me about your life before Colin brought you to that summit. Lila hesitated, unaccustomed to anyone showing genuine interest in her history, beyond simple curiosity about her usefulness. There is little to tell, she said eventually. My mother passed when I was young. My father followed several years later. Colin inherited what little property remained, and I became, in practical terms, a burden he tolerated, rather than a sister he valued. That does not sound like a burden, Rowan said quietly. That sounds like survival. Perhaps, Lila allowed, though survival often felt very lonely as well, particularly once I understood that my size and quiet nature made me easy to dismiss, easy to overlook entirely in favor of louder, more confident voices. Rowan's expression darkened slightly, though though not with judgment toward her, rather with quiet anger, directed at circumstances he could not change retroactively. "You deserved better than that," he said firmly. "Perhaps," Lila repeated, though something in his conviction eased a wound she had carried for most of her life, without fully realizing how heavy it had grown. "Though I have found, recently, that perhaps I deserve more than I once believed possible." Their eyes met across the firelight, something unspoken passing between them that neither seemed ready to name directly, though the air between them felt charged with a warmth neither could entirely deny. Rowan reached forward slowly, his hand settling gently over hers where it rested near the fire, and Lila did not pull away. "You are remarkable, Lila," he said quietly. "Not despite your size, not because of some pity I might feel toward your circumstances, but because of who you genuinely are. Sharp, honest, courageous in ways most nobles surrounding my throne could never hope to match." Lila's heart pounded, uncertain how to respond to words she had never expected to hear directed toward her, spoken with such quiet, unwavering sincerity. "I do not know what to say," she admitted honestly. "You need not say anything," Rowan replied, a gentle smile touching his features. "Simply know that I see you, truly see you, in ways I suspect few others in your life ever have." They remained like that for a while longer, hands lightly touching, the fire slowly dimming, as the rest of the camp settled into quiet rest around them, neither willing to break the fragile, comfortable intimacy that had grown unexpectedly between them throughout this dangerous, unpredictable journey. Eventually, practicality reasserted itself, and they parted for the night, each retreating to separate tents, with unspoken understanding hanging quietly between them. Lila lay awake long afterward, replaying his words carefully in her mind, uncertain what exactly this growing connection meant for her future, for whatever complicated political currents continued swirling around Colin's ambitions, and the still unresolved mystery of who had betrayed their travel plans to hostile ambushers. Yet despite the uncertainty, despite the danger that had nearly claimed both their lives days earlier, Lila found herself falling asleep, with something resembling genuine hope settling warmly in her chest. Hope that perhaps, for the first time in her life, she had found someone who valued her, not for what she could offer, but simply for who she was. The following morning brought renewed urgency, as scouts reported signs of continued unrest along several other territorial borders, unrelated to Vasari's now resolved dispute. Rowan's expression grew serious once more, as reports accumulated, each pointing toward growing instability that demanded his immediate attention upon their return to the palace. "There is much still unresolved," he said grimly, reviewing the scouts' findings with his advisors. "The ambush against us, this new unrest, all of it suggests deeper currents of conspiracy than a single territorial dispute." Lila listened carefully, her mind already working through possible connections between these seemingly separate crises, determined to offer whatever insight her knowledge of old treaties and regional history might provide, as they hurried the remaining distance back toward the palace, uncertain what new challenges awaited them upon their return. "Do you believe these disturbances are connected to the ambush?" she asked Rowan quietly, as they rode side by side through the final stretch of forest before the palace walls came into view. "I believe it would be foolish to assume they are not," he answered, his jaw tight with focused concern. "Someone benefits from instability spreading across multiple territories at once. Vasari's aggressive demands, the ambush against our delegation, now unrest along borders that have remained peaceful for years. This pattern feels deliberate rather than coincidental." "Who would benefit from such widespread chaos?" Lila asked. "That is precisely what I intend to discover," Rowan said grimly. "Whoever orchestrates this clearly hopes to weaken my authority before I have fully secured my father's throne. A young king facing simultaneous crises across multiple fronts appears vulnerable, easily challenged by ambitious rivals waiting for the right moment to strike." Lila considered his words carefully, her mind returning uneasily to Colin's calculating nature, though she still resisted directly voicing her suspicion without concrete evidence. "You suspect someone within your own court," she said instead, phrasing it as observation rather than direct accusation. "I suspect many people," Rowan admitted. "Trust becomes a luxury few kings can afford freely, particularly one as newly crowned as myself. Yet strangely, Lila, you remain one of the few individuals within my circle whose loyalty I have never once questioned." The admission settled warmly in her chest, despite the seriousness of their conversation. "Thank you for that trust," she said quietly. "I hope I continue to prove worthy of it, whatever conspiracy we ultimately uncover." "You already have," Rowan said simply, his eyes meeting hers with quiet certainty, before the palace gates finally emerged fully into view ahead, marking the end of their dangerous journey, and the beginning, Lila suspected, of an even more complicated investigation into the hidden forces working against the throne she had somehow found herself standing beside. As the delegation approached the outer gates, Lila noticed the guards stationed there, exchanging quick, uneasy glances before hurrying to open the entrance, their movements slightly too rushed to be purely ceremonial. Rowan noticed as well, his posture straightening with renewed alertness, despite the fatigue of their long journey. "Something has happened while we were away," he murmured, urging his horse forward at a quicker pace. Lila followed close behind, her earlier warmth giving way to fresh apprehension as they rode through the gates and into the courtyard, where a cluster of anxious advisors already waited, their expressions grave enough to suggest that whatever news awaited them, it would not be welcome. The advisors' grave expressions gave way to urgent explanation the moment Rowan dismounted, though the news they carried had nothing to do with fresh attacks or territorial disputes. "My king, we uncovered something troubling while reviewing correspondence records during your absence," the silver-haired advisor explained, leading them quickly toward a private chamber away from curious onlookers. "A letter, intercepted by palace guards, detailing information about your delegation's route and timing, sent to an unknown recipient outside the palace walls 3 days before your departure." Lila's stomach tightened as she followed Rowan into the chamber, already suspecting where this revelation might lead. "Who sent it?" Rowan demanded. The advisor hesitated, glancing briefly toward Lila before answering. "The handwriting matches records belonging to Colin, of the Eastern Holdings." The words hit Lila like a physical blow. She had suspected, feared even, that her stepbrother's schemes might eventually cross dangerous lines, but hearing confirmation that he had directly endangered Rowan's life, and her own, left her momentarily unable to speak. "There must be some mistake," she finally managed, though even as she spoke the words, doubt crept into her voice. "The evidence is quite specific," the advisor said gently, clearly aware of the difficult position this revelation placed her in. "The letter details your exact travel route, timing, and even mentions your presence within the delegation specifically." Rowan's expression had darkened considerably, though when he turned toward Lila, his eyes held no accusation, only careful concern. "Lila, I need you to understand that whatever your stepbrother has done, it reflects on him alone, not on you. He nearly got you killed," Lila said, her voice trembling now with anger and disbelief intertwined. "He nearly got me killed as well. For what purpose? What could he possibly have gained from selling information to whoever attacked us?" "That is precisely what we must discover," Rowan said grimly. "Bring Colin to the council chamber immediately," he instructed a nearby guard. "I want answers directly from him before we proceed further." The guard departed quickly, and Lila found herself pacing the small chamber, her mind racing through every interaction with Colin since arriving at the palace, searching for clues she might have missed, warning signs she had perhaps ignored, in favor of believing her stepbrother's ambition remained merely selfish rather than genuinely dangerous. "I should have suspected something," she said quietly, more to herself than to Rowan. "He was so eager for my usefulness to advance our family's position. I assumed his schemes remained contained to court politics, favors, alliances. I never imagined he would risk actual lives." "You could not have known the full extent of his ambition," Rowan said gently, moving closer despite the tension of the moment. "Do not carry guilt for choices that were entirely his own." Before Lila could respond further, the chamber door opened, and Colin entered, flanked by 2 palace guards, whose stern expressions left little doubt about the seriousness of the situation. Colin's face carried a mixture of confusion and barely concealed anxiety as his eyes moved between Rowan's grim expression and Lila's visible distress. "What is the meaning of this?" Colin demanded, though his voice lacked its usual confident bravado. "We intercepted correspondence matching your handwriting," Rowan said, his voice cold and controlled. "A letter detailing our delegation's exact travel plans, sent 3 days before our departure to an unknown recipient. Shortly after our departure, we were ambushed precisely along the route described in that letter." Colin's face paled visibly, though he attempted to maintain his composure. "I do not know what you are referring to, my king. I sent no such letter." "Do not lie to me," Rowan said, his voice sharpening with barely contained fury. "The handwriting has been verified against your own correspondence records. I want the truth, Colin, and I want it now." Lila watched her stepbrother carefully, searching his expression for any sign of genuine confusion rather than practiced deception, though years of watching him navigate difficult situations with calculated ease made it difficult to discern truth from performance. "Colin," she said quietly, stepping closer despite her anger, "whatever agreement you made, whoever you were negotiating with, please, tell the truth now. Lives were nearly lost because of that information." Something in her voice, perhaps the genuine hurt beneath her words, finally broke through Colin's carefully maintained composure. His shoulders slumped slightly, the confident mask he wore so consistently, finally cracking under the weight of undeniable evidence. "I did not know they intended violence," he said finally, his voice quiet and strained. "I was approached weeks ago, before the summit even began, by representatives claiming interest in advancing our family's standing through information, rather than direct alliance. They offered considerable payment for details regarding palace movements, travel plans, nothing that seemed particularly dangerous at the time. You sold information about my safety for money," Rowan said, disbelief and anger coloring his voice in equal measure. "I did not know it would lead to an ambush," Colin insisted, though his voice carried little conviction now that the truth had finally emerged. "I believed the information served merely as leverage in negotiations, perhaps intelligence gathering, rather than a foundation for violence." "And when you learned of the attack?" Lila asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and profound disappointment. "When you learned that Rowan and I very nearly died because of information you provided, what did you think then?" Colin could not meet her eyes. "I was afraid," he admitted quietly. "Afraid of what might happen if the truth came out. Afraid of losing whatever standing I had built within this court, through your usefulness to the king." "You built nothing," Lila said, her voice rising with an anger she had rarely allowed herself to express so directly toward her stepbrother. "I built my own worth through my own effort, and you nearly destroyed everything, nearly cost people their lives, simply because you were too afraid to admit weakness, or too greedy to consider consequences beyond your own advancement." Rowan remained silent throughout this exchange, allowing Lila the space to confront her stepbrother directly, though his expression carried a barely restrained fury that suggested significant consequences awaited Colin, regardless of whatever explanation he offered. "Who approached you?" Rowan finally demanded. "I want names, details, everything you remember about these representatives who sought this information." Colin hesitated, glancing nervously toward the guards flanking him. "I do not know their true identities," he admitted. "They approached me through an intermediary, someone claiming connection to territories, seeking greater influence within regional politics. I never met them directly, only communicated through carefully arranged letters and a single meeting in a tavern outside the palace grounds." "Describe this meeting," Rowan instructed. Colin recounted what details he could recall, though his description remained frustratingly vague, offering little concrete evidence beyond confirming that whoever had orchestrated this conspiracy had taken considerable care to conceal their true identity, even from the person they had recruited to provide information. "This conspiracy extends beyond your stepbrother alone," Rowan said finally, turning toward Lila with grim determination. "Someone with significant resources and connections is working to destabilize this kingdom, using Colin merely as one piece within a much larger scheme." Lila nodded, though her heart remained heavy with the betrayal she had just witnessed, however unintentional Colin claimed his actions had been. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Colin will be held for further questioning," Rowan said. "His actions, regardless of intention, constitute treason against this crown. However cooperative he proves during our investigation may influence how severely that treason is ultimately judged." Colin's face went pale at the word treason, the full weight of his choices finally settling visibly across his features. "Lila," he said quietly, turning toward her with something resembling genuine regret, for perhaps the first time since she had known him, "I never intended for anyone to be harmed, least of all you." "Intentions matter little when the consequences nearly cost lives," Lila replied, her voice steady, despite the emotional turmoil churning beneath her calm exterior. I hope for your sake that your cooperation now proves more genuine than your previous choices. The guards led Colin away, toward a secure chamber, where he would remain until further questioning could uncover additional details about the conspiracy he had unknowingly, or perhaps knowingly, become entangled within. Lila remained standing in the council chamber, her body trembling slightly with the aftermath of confronting her stepbrother so directly. Rowan moved closer, his hand settling gently on her shoulder. You did not deserve this betrayal, he said quietly. Not from someone who should have protected you, rather than endangering your life for personal gain. I keep wondering if I should have seen it coming, Lila admitted, her voice unsteady. If there were signs I ignored, because acknowledging them meant confronting how little my own safety mattered to him. You could not have prevented his choices, Rowan said firmly. Do not carry guilt that belongs entirely to him. Lila nodded, though the weight of Colin's betrayal settled heavily within her chest, regardless of Rowan's reassurance. Somewhere within this conspiracy lay answers to who truly sought to destabilize the kingdom, who had orchestrated an ambush that nearly claimed both their lives, and Lila found herself determined, despite her heartbreak over her stepbrother's actions, to help uncover the full truth before this hidden enemy could strike again, with even greater consequences. Later that evening, alone in her chamber, Lila finally allowed herself to grieve the version of family she had never truly possessed, but had still, somewhere in her heart, hoped might someday exist. Colin had never been kind, never been protective in the way siblings were meant to be, yet she had clung to a small, stubborn hope that beneath his ambition remained some genuine care for her well-being. Tonight that hope had finally shattered completely. She thought of her mother's words, spoken so long ago, about courage mattering more than size. She wondered what her mother would think of Colin's choices, of the danger he had carelessly invited into their lives for the sake of coin and standing. Grief and anger tangled together uncomfortably in her chest, leaving her uncertain which emotion deserved more of her attention. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find Rowan standing there, having apparently sought her out, despite the late hour, and the many pressing matters surely demanding his attention following Colin's confession. I did not want you to sit with this alone tonight, he said simply. Lila stepped aside, allowing him into the small chamber, grateful beyond words for his consideration. Thank you, she said quietly. I did not realize how much I needed company until you arrived. You have shown remarkable strength today, Rowan said, settling into the chair near her small window. Confronting Colin so directly, maintaining composure, despite the depth of his betrayal. Few people could manage such clarity, while processing genuine heartbreak. It does not feel like strength, Lila admitted. It feels like exhaustion, pretending to be composure. Perhaps that is what strength often looks like, Rowan offered gently. Not the absence of pain, but the choice to continue moving forward despite it. They talked quietly for a while longer, the conversation drifting between the immediate crisis of Colin's betrayal and gentler subjects, memories of childhood, small comforts that had nothing to do with politics or conspiracy. Lila found herself grateful for the distraction, for the steady, comforting presence beside her that asked nothing in return beyond simple companionship during a difficult night. Eventually, Rowan rose to leave, though he paused at the doorway, glancing back toward her, with an expression she could not quite read. Whatever happens next, Lila, know that you are not alone in facing it, not anymore. The words settled warmly in her chest, long after he had gone, a small comfort against the heavy uncertainty of everything still unresolved, everything still hidden within the growing conspiracy threatening the kingdom she had somehow, despite everything, come to genuinely care about protecting. The following morning, Lila requested permission to see Colin in the secure chamber where he remained under guard. Rowan granted the request without hesitation, though he warned her gently that Colin's continued questioning had revealed little additional information beyond what he had already confessed. Colin looked smaller somehow when she found him, stripped of his usual confident posture, sitting quietly against the stone wall of his temporary confinement. He looked up as she entered, surprise and cautious hope flickering across his tired features. I did not expect you to come, he said quietly. I needed to understand, Lila replied, remaining near the doorway rather than approaching closer. Was any part of your care for me genuine, Colin? Or was I only ever a tool to you, from the very beginning? Colin was quiet for a long moment, as though searching honestly within himself for an answer he had perhaps never examined before. I do not know how to separate the two, he admitted finally. I told myself I was securing our future, our safety, and perhaps some part of that was true. But I cannot deny that I saw you as a means to an end, far more often than I saw you simply as my sister. The honesty, however painful, felt like the first truthful thing he had offered her in years. Thank you for finally admitting that, she said quietly, before turning to leave, uncertain when, or if, she would see him again, but resolved to move forward regardless, carrying forward only the parts of herself that Colin's betrayal had never truly touched. The accusation arrived like a thunderclap during what should have been an ordinary council session, shattering whatever fragile peace Leela had begun to feel following Colin's confinement. My king, announced Garrick, the same territory leader whose border dispute Lila had helped resolve weeks earlier, though his expression now carried none of the gratitude he had shown then. I bring troubling information regarding the woman standing beside your throne. The council chamber fell silent, every eye turning toward Lila, who stood near her usual position close to Rowan's side, uncertain what accusation could possibly be forthcoming from someone she had previously helped. Speak clearly, Rowan instructed, though his tone carried a wary edge that suggested he anticipated nothing good from this sudden interruption. New evidence has surfaced, suggesting Colin was not acting alone in his betrayal, Garrick continued, his voice carrying deliberately across the silent chamber. Additional correspondence discovered within his private quarters implicates his stepsister directly in coordinating information shared with hostile parties. Lila's breath caught, disbelief and fear tangling together as murmurs erupted throughout the assembled nobles. That is impossible, she said, her voice carrying more strength than she felt. I had no knowledge of Colin's actions until they were revealed to this very council. The evidence suggests otherwise, Garrick pressed, producing a folded letter that he presented to Rowan's advisors for examination. This correspondence, written in a hand closely resembling her own, discusses details regarding the delegation's travel plans weeks before the ambush occurred. Rowan's expression darkened as his silver-haired advisor examined the letter carefully, comparing it against samples of Lila's handwriting from her earlier translation work within the archive. The similarities are concerning, the advisor admitted reluctantly, though not conclusive. I did not write that letter, Lila said firmly, though panic tightened her chest as she watched suspicious glances spreading throughout the chamber. Whoever forged this document clearly intended to implicate me, perhaps to shift blame away from Colin's true accomplices. A convenient claim, Garrick countered, given how thoroughly you have insinuated yourself into this king's confidence, despite your complete lack of noble standing or verified background. The room's tension thickened considerably, nobles who had grown suspicious of Lila's rapid rise within court, now finding renewed justification for their doubts. Even those who had previously seemed neutral toward her presence now regarded her with fresh uncertainty, uncertain whether to trust evidence presented so publicly against someone whose true loyalties suddenly seemed less clear. This accusation demands serious investigation, one senior advisor said carefully, glancing toward Rowan for guidance. Given the severity of the original conspiracy, we cannot simply dismiss evidence, however troubling its implications. Rowan's jaw tightened visibly, torn between his personal conviction regarding Lila's innocence and the political reality that dismissing such evidence outright might appear as favoritism rather than justice. The letter will be examined thoroughly, he said finally, his voice controlled despite the visible tension in his posture. Until its authenticity can be verified or disproven, Lila will remain within the palace, under observation, though I will not confine her as a prisoner, without clear evidence of genuine guilt. My king, Garrick pressed further, surely the severity of this potential betrayal warrants stronger precaution, particularly given her proximity to your person, during the very attack this evidence suggests she may have helped orchestrate. Lila felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, judgment and suspicion radiating from nobles who had never truly welcomed her presence within these walls. She glanced toward Rowan, searching his expression for reassurance, though even his carefully controlled composure could not fully hide the difficult position this public accusation placed him within. I understand the council's concern, Rowan said finally, addressing the gathered nobles directly. However, I will not condemn someone based on evidence not yet fully verified, regardless of how convenient such condemnation might prove. for those eager to see her removed from this court. The implication in his final words hung heavily in the air, a pointed suggestion that perhaps this accusation served purposes beyond simple justice. Garrick's expression tightened slightly, though he said nothing further, retreating to his position among the assembled nobles with visible reluctance. Once the council session finally concluded, Rowan requested a private meeting with Lila, away from the chamber's lingering suspicion. They retreated to his private study, where the weight of the day's accusation settled heavily between them, despite the privacy now surrounding their conversation. "I did not write that letter," Lila repeated, her voice trembling slightly now that the pressure of public scrutiny had eased. "You believe me, don't you?" "I believe you completely," Rowan said without hesitation, though his expression remained troubled. "But belief alone will not satisfy a council, increasingly convinced that conspiracy runs deeper than Colin's confession suggested. We must find proof of forgery, or identify whoever truly authored that letter, before this accusation gains further momentum against you." "Who would forge such evidence?" Lila asked, her mind racing through possibilities even as fear continued tightening around her chest. "Someone determined to remove me from your court, certainly. But who benefits enough from my downfall to risk such an elaborate deception?" Rowan considered the question carefully, pacing slowly across his study as he worked through the implications. "Perhaps the same person who orchestrated the original ambush," he said finally. "If conspiracy against this throne runs deeper than Colin's involvement suggests, removing you from my confidence would eliminate someone capable of uncovering further truth. You have proven valuable in ways that clearly threaten whoever seeks to destabilize this kingdom. Then we must find evidence proving my innocence, before this accusation destroys everything I have worked to build here," Lila said, determination replacing some of her earlier fear. "We will find it," Rowan said firmly, his hand settling gently over hers in quiet reassurance. "I will not allow false accusations to strip away everything you have rightfully earned through genuine service to this kingdom." Despite his reassurance, the following days brought increasing difficulty, as suspicion spread throughout the palace. Servants who had once treated her kindly now regarded her with cautious distance, uncertain whether associating with someone accused of treason might reflect poorly on their own standing. Nobles who had previously remained neutral now openly questioned her presence within court, whispering behind carefully raised hands whenever she passed. Lila spent long hours within the archive, searching desperately through old correspondence and legal records for anything that might help identify the true author of the forged letter, comparing handwriting samples, and searching for patterns that might reveal the conspiracy's true source. Rowan joined her whenever his duties allowed, though the growing political pressure surrounding the accusation limited how much direct time he could dedicate to the investigation, without appearing to favor her over impartial justice. "I found something," Lila said one evening, several days into her desperate search, holding up 2 documents side by side. "Look at this correspondence, sent from Garrick's own territory several months ago, regarding a minor trade dispute. Notice the particular curve in his scribe's handwriting, here, along the letter formations." Rowan leaned closer, studying the documents carefully. "You believe Garrick's own scribe authored the forged letter?" "I cannot be certain," Lila admitted, "but the similarities are striking enough to warrant further investigation. If Garrick himself orchestrated this accusation, perhaps to eliminate someone he perceives as a threat to his own influence within your court, his scribe may have been responsible for creating the forgery." Rowan's expression sharpened with renewed determination. "This could prove crucial," he said. "If we can verify this connection, it may unravel not only this false accusation against you, but potentially reveal Garrick's involvement in the broader conspiracy threatening this kingdom." "We must proceed carefully," Lila cautioned. "If Garrick suspects we are investigating his involvement before we have conclusive proof, he may destroy evidence, or flee entirely, taking whatever information he possesses about the larger conspiracy with him." Rowan nodded, his mind already working through strategies for confirming this crucial connection without alerting Garrick to their suspicions. "Tomorrow, I will request formal handwriting samples from all council members, framing it as a routine security measure following Colin's betrayal. This should allow us to compare Garrick's scribe's handwriting directly against the forged letter without revealing our specific suspicions." Lila nodded, a fragile hope beginning to settle within her chest despite the exhaustion of the past difficult days. Perhaps, finally, they were close to uncovering the truth that would clear her name and reveal the deeper conspiracy still threatening the kingdom she had come to care about so deeply, despite every obstacle working against her continued place within it. That night, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion weighing heavily on her body, Lila walked slowly through the quiet palace corridors, seeking the small comfort of fresh air within the western courtyard. She had not expected to encounter anyone at such a late hour, and startled slightly when a familiar voice spoke softly from the shadows near the garden wall. "Could not sleep either?" Rowan asked, stepping into the moonlight where she could see him clearly. "Too much weighing on my mind," Lila admitted, moving to stand beside him near the low stone wall overlooking the training fields beyond. "I keep wondering what will happen if we cannot prove Garrick's involvement before the council demands formal judgment against me." "That will not happen," Rowan said firmly. "I have delayed the council's demand for judgment as long as political pressure allows, but I will not permit them to condemn you, regardless of what evidence we manage to gather." "You cannot simply override the council's authority," Lila said quietly. "Not without appearing to favor me unfairly, which would only fuel further suspicion rather than ease it." "Perhaps," Rowan acknowledged, "though I find myself increasingly unwilling to weigh political convenience against genuine justice, particularly when your life and reputation hang in the balance." Lila studied his profile in the moonlight, the quiet determination evident in his expression despite the exhaustion visible beneath his composed exterior. "Why do you fight so hard for me?" she asked softly. "I am not noble, not powerful, not someone whose favor could meaningfully strengthen your throne through alliance or marriage. Why, by every political calculation, defending me so fiercely serves you poorly." Rowan turned to face her fully, something vulnerable entering his expression that she had rarely witnessed from him before. "Because political calculation has never been the only measure I use for what matters," he said quietly. "You matter to me, Lila, beyond whatever usefulness you provide this kingdom. I have come to care for you deeply, in ways that have very little to do with politics at all." The admission settled warmly through her chest, despite the fear and exhaustion of recent days. "I care for you as well," she admitted quietly, the words feeling both terrifying and freeing to finally speak aloud. "More than I expected to, given how impossible such feelings seemed when I first arrived at this palace." They stood together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the weight of unspoken feelings finally acknowledged between them, offering a small measure of comfort against the considerable uncertainty still surrounding Lila's future within this court. Eventually, practicality reasserted itself, reminding them both of the urgent investigation still required to clear her name completely, and they parted for the night, with renewed determination to uncover whatever truth remained hidden within Garrick's suspicious involvement. The handwriting samples arrived within 2 days, collected under the pretense of a routine security measure that raised no immediate suspicion among the council members, exactly as Rowan had hoped. Lila spent the following night comparing each sample meticulously against the forged letter, her eyes straining under candlelight as she searched for the distinctive curves and formations she had noticed earlier. By dawn, she had found what she needed. "Here," she said, presenting the evidence to Rowan as he entered his study, exhaustion evident in the dark circles beneath her eyes. "The scribe employed within Garrick's household. The formation of certain letters matches precisely, the same slight upward curve on the letter that appears throughout the forged accusation against me." Rowan examined the samples carefully, his expression hardening as the evidence became undeniable. "This is conclusive enough to bring before the council," he said, "though we must proceed carefully. Garrick will not accept this evidence without resistance, and we still do not know the full extent of his involvement in the broader conspiracy." "There is something else," Lila added, producing a second document she had discovered during her investigation. Correspondence between Garrick's household and a merchant operating along Vasari's border, discussing payment for services rendered shortly before the ambush occurred. The timing aligns precisely with when Colin claims he was approached about sharing the delegation's travel information. Rowan's jaw tightened as he studied this additional evidence. "Garrick orchestrated the entire conspiracy," he said grimly. "The ambush, the forged letter implicating you, all of it designed to weaken my authority, while eliminating anyone capable of uncovering his involvement. We must present this before the full council immediately," Lila said, "before he has any opportunity to destroy further evidence or flee entirely." Rowan nodded, already moving toward the door to summon his advisors. "Prepare yourself," he said, glancing back at her with quiet determination. This confrontation will not be simple, but the truth will finally be revealed before everyone who has doubted you. The council chamber filled quickly once word spread that Rowan intended to address the ongoing accusation against Lila directly. Garrick arrived with his usual confident posture, though something flickered briefly across his expression when he noticed the document spread across the table before Rowan's seat. "My king," Garrick began, "I trust you bring resolution to this troubling matter at last." "I do," Rowan said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent chamber. "Though perhaps not the resolution you anticipated." He gestured for his silver-haired advisor to present the handwriting comparison to the assembled council. "This evidence demonstrates conclusively that the letter accusing Lila of conspiracy was forged by a scribe within your own household, Garrick." Murmurs erupted throughout the chamber as nobles leaned forward to examine the presented evidence. Garrick's composed expression finally cracked, alarm flickering beneath his carefully maintained authority. "This is absurd," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confident conviction. "Any scribe's handwriting might share superficial similarities. Superficial similarities do not typically extend to correspondence discussing payment for services related directly to the ambush against my delegation," Rowan continued, producing the second document Lila had discovered. "This letter, found within records connecting your household to a merchant operating near Vasari's border, details payment arrangements timed precisely with when Colin claims he was recruited to share our travel plans." The chamber fell into stunned silence as the full weight of the evidence settled over the assembled nobles. Garrick's face had gone pale, his earlier confidence crumbling entirely under the accumulated proof laid before the entire court. "You orchestrated the ambush against your own king," Rowan said, his voice cold with barely restrained fury. "You recruited Colin to provide information, arranged for hostile forces to attack our delegation, and when that failed to eliminate the threat you perceived, you forged evidence to remove Lila from my confidence, hoping to eliminate whoever might uncover your involvement." Garrick started, though no convincing denial emerged from his stammering attempt at defense. "Why?" Lila asked quietly, stepping forward despite every instinct urging her toward silence. "What did you hope to gain from such elaborate betrayal against your own king?" Garrick's composure finally shattered completely under the weight of the question, genuine desperation replacing his earlier confident denial. "Power shifts constantly between territories," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "A young king, untested, vulnerable to crisis after crisis, appears weak to territories, watching for opportunity. I believe that if enough instability accumulated during your early reign, other territories might question your capability to rule, opening opportunities for realignment that would benefit my own position considerably." "You nearly caused a war with Vasari," Rowan said, disbelief evident beneath his controlled anger. "You endangered countless lives, orchestrated violence, against your own king, all for the possibility of personal advancement." "I did not intend for anyone to die," Garrick said weakly, though the excuse rang hollow, given the calculated nature of his elaborate conspiracy. "Intent matters little when weighed against such deliberate and extensive betrayal," Rowan said firmly, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the silent chamber. He turned to address the full council directly. "Garrick has committed treason against this crown, endangering this kingdom's stability through calculated violence and deception. I want him held immediately, pending full investigation into the extent of his conspiracy, and any additional accomplices beyond Colin, who himself will face judgment for his unwitting participation in this scheme." Guards moved forward to detain Garrick, whose earlier confidence had entirely dissolved into desperate, quiet resignation, as the reality of his exposed conspiracy finally settled fully upon him. As he was led from the chamber, several nobles who had previously supported his accusations against Lila now regarded her with visible discomfort, understanding belatedly how thoroughly they had allowed manipulation to cloud their judgment. Once Garrick had been removed from the chamber, Rowan turned to address the remaining council directly, his expression firm with unwavering conviction. "Lila's innocence has been proven beyond any reasonable doubt," he said. "More than innocence, however, her diligent investigation uncovered this conspiracy entirely, through her own effort, protecting this kingdom from a threat that might otherwise have continued unchecked." Murmurs of reluctant agreement spread through the chamber, though Lila noticed several nobles still regarding her with lingering uncertainty, unaccustomed to accepting someone of her humble background as a genuine asset rather than a convenient scapegoat. I understand that many among you have struggled to accept Leela's presence within this court, Rowan continued, his voice carrying unmistakable authority, despite its measured calm. Her size, her lack of noble title, her quiet demeanor, all of these superficial qualities have led many to underestimate her considerably. Yet time and again, she has proven herself more capable, more loyal, and more valuable to this kingdom than nobles who have held their positions for generations. The chamber remained silent, though Lila noticed several expressions shifting from skepticism towards something resembling genuine reconsideration. Rowan's words carried weight, precisely because they came without exaggeration, simply stating truths that recent events had made undeniable. Effective immediately, Rowan continued, Lila will be granted formal recognition within this court, no longer merely tolerated as a temporary advisor, but acknowledged as someone whose contributions to this kingdom's stability and safety warrant genuine respect and protection. The council chamber remained quiet for a long moment before the silver-haired advisor, who had supported Lila throughout her investigation, stepped forward with a slight bow. A wise decision, my king. This kingdom benefits considerably from recognizing genuine merit, regardless of the humble circumstances from which it emerges. Slowly, reluctantly, other council members offered similar acknowledgement, some more genuine than others, though the overall shift within the chamber suggested that Lila's standing within this court had finally solidified beyond mere tolerance into something resembling authentic respect. As the council session finally concluded and nobles began filing from the chamber, Rowan approached Lila directly, his expression softening from the controlled authority he had maintained throughout the confrontation with Garrick. You did this, he said quietly. Your careful investigation uncovered a conspiracy that might have continued destabilizing this kingdom indefinitely otherwise. We did this together, Lila corrected gently. I could not have gathered such evidence without your trust and support throughout this difficult investigation. Rowan smiled, something warm and genuine replacing the exhaustion that had weighed on his features throughout recent days. Then let us continue facing whatever challenges remain together, he said. As we have proven, time and again, we are considerably stronger united than divided. Lila returned his smile, relief and quiet triumph settling warmly through her chest, despite the difficult weeks that had led toward this moment of vindication. Whatever remained of Garrick's conspiracy, whatever consequences awaited Colin for his unwitting participation, she felt, for the first time since arriving at this palace, genuinely secure in her place within these walls, standing beside a king who had never once doubted her worth, despite every obstacle working against her. In the days that followed, the palace settled gradually into a different rhythm than the one Lila had grown accustomed to during her difficult weeks under suspicion. Servants who had once kept careful distance now greeted her warmly, some even seeking her out directly, to express quiet admiration for how she had endured such public accusation with dignity and tact. Nobles who had doubted her began, slowly and with visible reluctance, to treat her with the cautious respect typically reserved for someone whose value could no longer be denied. Garrick's full investigation revealed additional details over the following days, uncovering connections between his household and several minor conspirators who had assisted various aspects of his scheme, though nothing suggested the conspiracy extended significantly beyond his own personal ambition. Rowan ordered a thorough restructuring of security protocols surrounding sensitive information, ensuring that future travel plans and diplomatic missions would remain considerably more protected against similar betrayal. Colin's judgment proved more complicated, given his cooperation once confronted with evidence of his actions, weighed against the severity of endangering the king's life through his careless greed. Rowan ultimately decided upon exile from court rather than harsher punishment, stripping Colin of whatever minor standing he had once held within the Eastern holdings, though allowing him to retain his life and freedom outside the palace's immediate influence. I do not know if I made the correct decision regarding your stepbrother, Rowan admitted to Lila one quiet evening, as they walked together through the palace gardens now blooming fully with early summer flowers. Harsher punishment might have served justice more completely, given the severity of his betrayal. I believe you found the right balance, Lila said thoughtfully. Colin's actions caused genuine harm, yet his cooperation, however delayed, helped uncover Garrick's deeper conspiracy. Exile allows him consequence without destroying whatever small possibility remains for him to build a different life, away from the ambition that led him toward such dangerous choices. Rowan nodded, considering her words carefully. You show remarkable grace towards someone who nearly cost you everything. Grace does not mean forgetting what happened, Lila clarified, only choosing not to let anger consume what remains of my own future, particularly now that I finally have reason to look forward toward that future, with genuine hope rather than mere survival. Rowan turned to face her fully amid the fragrant garden, something tender and unmistakably sincere entering his expression. Speaking of that future, he said quietly, I find myself considering it more seriously than perhaps I should admit so soon after such difficult weeks. Lila's heart quickened at his words, uncertain exactly what he intended to say, though hope stirred gently within her chest, regardless of her uncertainty. What do you mean? She asked softly. I mean, Rowan said, his voice carrying quiet vulnerability, rarely displayed before anyone beyond his closest circle, that I have come to care for you, far beyond simple gratitude for your service to this kingdom. I find myself imagining a future where you remain beside me, not merely as a valued advisor, but as someone considerably more significant within my life. The garden fell silent around them, evening light casting warm gold across blooming flowers and quiet stone pathways, as Lila absorbed the weight of his words, hope and uncertainty tangling together within her chest, as she considered exactly what such a future might mean, both for herself and for the kingdom watching curiously to see what emerged from this unlikely, hard-won connection between a king and the smallest person who had ever stood within his court. Lila stood in the quiet garden, Rowan's words still hanging in the warm evening air between them, and found herself unable to speak for several long moments, overwhelmed by everything those words implied. You want me beside you, she finally managed, her voice soft with disbelief. Not as an advisor, but as something more. I want you beside me for the rest of my life, however that arrangement might unfold, Rowan said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability evident in his expression. I have watched you face danger, betrayal, and public humiliation, with courage few nobles born into privilege could ever match. I have come to value your mind, your honesty, your quiet strength, more than I ever anticipated when you first stumbled into my hall weeks ago. Lila felt tears gathering unexpectedly, emotion overwhelming the careful composure she had maintained throughout so many difficult weeks. I never imagined someone in your position could see me this way, she admitted. For most of my life, I have been overlooked, dismissed, treated as insignificant, simply because of my size, my quiet nature, my lack of standing. You have never once made me feel that way. Because you were never insignificant, Rowan said firmly, stepping closer to take her hands gently within his own. Your size never diminished your worth, not for a single moment since I first caught you before you fell in that crowded hall. I saw someone capable of far more than the room around her recognized, and every day since has only confirmed that first impression. They stood together in comfortable silence, the weight of genuine feeling finally acknowledged openly between them, after weeks of careful restraint and mounting danger. Lila studied his features in the fading evening light, searching for any hesitation, any doubt that might suggest his words carried less conviction than they seemed to hold, but found only steady, unwavering sincerity, reflected back at her. I care for you as well, she said finally, her voice steadier now despite the emotion still coloring her tone. More deeply than I believed possible, given everything working against such feelings developing between someone of my humble background and a king carrying the weight of an entire kingdom. Titles and background matter far less to me than genuine character, Rowan said. And your character, Lila, is the finest I have encountered throughout my entire life. Word of their growing connection spread quickly through the palace over the following weeks, though Rowan made no attempt to conceal his feelings, choosing instead to court her openly, rather than hide behind political caution. Some nobles continued to whisper skeptically, unable to fully release their ingrained prejudice against someone lacking noble title, but many others, having witnessed her courage and competence firsthand, began to genuinely welcome the possibility of her elevated standing within their court. 3 months after Garrick's conspiracy had been fully uncovered and resolved, Rowan called for a formal gathering within the same great hall where Lila had first stumbled before his entire court, though this time, no laughter greeted her entrance, only respectful silence and curious anticipation. She wore a dress far finer than anything she had owned previously, gifted to her by Rowan's own request, deep blue fabric that complemented her modest frame, while still allowing her to feel genuinely herself, rather than transformed into someone unrecognizable. She walked toward the throne where Rowan waited, his expression carrying a mixture of nervous anticipation and unmistakable warmth as she approached. "Nobles of this kingdom," Rowan announced, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "Months ago, many of you witnessed a woman stumble within these very walls, mocked for her size, dismissed as insignificant among gathered leaders who believed themselves her superior in every meaningful way." Murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd, some nobles shifting uncomfortably, as memories of that earlier humiliation resurfaced clearly. "That woman," Rowan continued, "has since proven herself more valuable to this kingdom than nobles who have held their positions for generations. She resolved conflicts that threatened war between territories. She uncovered a conspiracy that endangered my very life, alongside the stability of this entire kingdom. She endured public accusation and betrayal with dignity and grace that few among you could match, and through it all, she never once compromised her honesty or her fundamental goodness." Lila felt her cheeks warming under the weight of his public praise, though she remained standing steadily beside the throne, meeting the gathered crowd's attention with far more confidence than she had possessed during her first difficult days within this palace. "I have come to love this woman," Rowan continued, his voice carrying genuine emotion beneath its formal authority, not despite her humble background, not out of pity for her circumstances, but because her character represents everything I believe true nobility should embody: courage, honesty, compassion, wisdom, earned through hardship rather than privilege. He turned to face Lila directly, kneeling before her in a gesture that sent fresh murmurs of astonishment through the watching crowd. A king, kneeling before someone many had once dismissed as utterly insignificant. "Lila," he said, his voice softer now, meant for her alone despite the hundreds of witnesses gathered around them. "Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife, ruling beside me as queen of this kingdom, not because your size ever needed elevation, but because your heart has always been large enough to deserve exactly this place beside me?" Tears finally spilled freely down Lila's cheeks, months of hardship, betrayal, danger, and quiet hope, culminating in this singular moment that she had never truly believed possible for someone like herself. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion, despite her best efforts at composure. "Yes, I will marry you, Rowan." The hall erupted into genuine celebration, applause and cheers replacing the cold silence and cruel laughter that had once greeted her within these same walls. Rowan rose to his feet, taking her hands gently within his own before drawing her into a warm embrace that spoke more clearly than any formal declaration could of the genuine affection binding them together. As the celebration continued around them, Lila caught sight of the silver-haired advisor who had supported her throughout the difficult investigation, offering a warm, genuine smile of approval. Even several nobles who had once doubted her openly now applauded with visible sincerity, having witnessed enough of her character over recent months to understand that whatever skepticism they once held had been entirely misplaced. The wedding itself, held several weeks later, brought together representatives from across the kingdom's territories, including, somewhat unexpectedly, Corwin of Vasari, who arrived bearing gifts and genuine well-wishes rather than the wary skepticism that had marked their first difficult negotiation. Even Colin, granted temporary permission to attend from his exile, watched quietly from the back of the grand hall, his expression carrying something resembling genuine, if bittersweet, happiness for the sister whose worth he had once so carelessly disregarded. As the ceremony concluded, and Rowan placed a simple, elegant crown upon her head, formally recognizing her as queen of the kingdom she had once entered as an overlooked, mocked outsider, Lila felt the full weight of her journey settle warmly within her chest. She thought of her mother's words, spoken so long ago about courage mattering more than size, and felt, for the first time in her entire life, that those words had finally been proven completely, undeniably true. Later that evening, standing together on a quiet balcony, overlooking the kingdom now formally under her care, alongside Rowan, Lila allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection on everything that had led toward this unexpected, hard-won happiness. "Do you ever think about that first day?" she asked softly, leaning against Rowan's steady presence beside her. "When I stumbled before your entire court, certain I would be remembered only for that humiliation?" "Often," Rowan admitted, wrapping his arm gently around her shoulders. though I remember it quite differently than you seem to. I remember catching someone whose eyes held more genuine honesty than any noble in that hall had shown me throughout my entire reign. I remember recognizing, in that single moment, someone worth protecting, worth respecting, long before I understood how deeply I would come to love her. Lila smiled, resting her head against his shoulder as they watched the kingdom settle into peaceful evening quiet below them. I was the smallest person in that room, she said softly. Yet you showed me greater respect than anyone had offered me throughout my entire life. You were never small in any way that truly mattered, Rowan replied, pressing a gentle kiss against her forehead. Your courage, your wisdom, your heart, all of it, far exceeded anyone else standing within that hall that day, regardless of your physical stature. They remained together on that quiet balcony, long into the evening, two people who had found genuine partnership through danger, betrayal, and hard-won truth, ruling now not through fear or manipulation, but through the same honest respect that had first drawn them together within a crowded hall where one small woman had stumbled, only to be caught by a king who recognized her true worth from that very first moment onward. Their reign together would prove long and prosperous, remembered throughout the kingdom's history, not merely for the peace and stability they maintained together, but for the enduring example they set of how genuine merit, courage, and honest character mattered far more than size, title, or privilege ever could. And though many years would pass, filled with their own challenges and triumphs, Lila never forgot the lesson her mother had taught her so long ago, carried finally into full, undeniable truth beside the king who had first shown her, and continued showing her every single day thereafter, the greatest respect she had ever known. In the months following their wedding, Lila settled gradually into her new role as queen, though she never abandoned the quiet habits that had first earned her Rowan's genuine respect. She continued spending long hours within the archive, cataloging forgotten treaties and regional histories, insisting that such knowledge remain accessible to future advisors, rather than buried beneath decades of neglect, as it had been when she first arrived at the palace. Under her guidance, the archive transformed from a dusty, overlooked corner of the palace into a respected center of learning, visited regularly by scholars and diplomats seeking clarity on old boundary disputes and historical agreements. She also made a point of personally greeting new servants and lesser attendees who arrived at court, remembering vividly how invisible she had once felt among the grand halls and towering nobles who surrounded the throne. Many young women, overlooked in their own villages for their quiet nature or humble background, found unexpected encouragement in Queen Lila's willingness to listen carefully to their concerns, treating them with the same genuine respect Rowan had once extended toward her. Rowan, for his part, continued ruling with the same steady, thoughtful authority that had first impressed her during that initial council session, though those who observed him closely noted a new warmth in his demeanor, a lightness that had been absent during his earliest, loneliest days upon the throne. He often sought Lila's counsel on matters extending well beyond ancient treaties, valuing her perspective on nearly every significant decision affecting their kingdom's future. Word of their partnership spread throughout neighboring territories as well, inspiring quiet conversations among other leaders about the value of recognizing merit beyond noble birth. Corwin of Vasari, in particular, became an unexpected ally in the years following their difficult negotiation, often sending word of gratitude for how fairly Lila had handled their border dispute, crediting her careful honesty with preventing a war that might have cost countless lives on both sides. Colin's fate remained more complicated, though not entirely without redemption. Living in quiet exile within a modest territory far from the palace, he gradually built a smaller, humbler life for himself, occasionally sending brief letters to Lila, expressing genuine remorse for his earlier choices. She responded to each letter with careful, measured kindness, neither fully forgiving the danger he had once invited into her life, nor entirely closing the door on whatever fragile relationship might yet be rebuilt between them, given enough time and demonstrated change. Years later, when their first child was born, a daughter with her mother's quiet, thoughtful eyes and her father's steady determination, Lila found herself standing once again on that same quiet balcony where Rowan had first spoken of loving her, cradling their infant daughter, while watching the kingdom settle into peaceful evening rest below. "She will grow up knowing her worth from the very beginning," Rowan said softly, joining her at the balcony's edge, his arm settling gently around her shoulders, as it had so many times before, never doubting, as you once did, that her size, or her quiet nature, might diminish her value in anyone's eyes. She will grow up watched over by a father who understands, better than most, that true strength has very little to do with how large someone appears to a crowded room, Lila replied, smiling down at their daughter's peaceful, sleeping face. And a mother who will make certain she never forgets that lesson, no matter how loudly the world might occasionally suggest otherwise. They stood together quietly, the kingdom stretching peacefully beneath them, their small family bound together by a love that had grown from courage and honesty, rather than convenient political alliance, proving once again, as it had proven so many times throughout their difficult, remarkable journey together, that genuine respect, once truly given, could transform not only two individual lives, but an entire kingdom's understanding of what real worth actually meant. And so the story of the smallest person who had ever stood within that grand hall became, in time, one of the kingdom's most cherished histories, told for generations afterward, to remind every child, regardless of their size or their humble beginnings, that the greatest respect often comes not from those who share our stature, but from those wise enough to recognize the true measure of our hearts.